The Navy, along with aviation, are the branches of the military in which Russia had an incredible advantage before the start of a full-scale invasion of Ukraine and until now, but it's useless. Why is the country with the third strongest navy losing a water war to Ukraine? The last attacks on Crimea and Russian Navy bases proved once more that Russian Navy superiority makes no sense on the battlefield. In this video, we will explain why. Let's start with the numbers. Prior to the invasion, the Russian naval forces had a total of 266 active units in their inventory. The Russian Navy placed a strong emphasis on safeguarding its coastline and conducting underwater operations, with a significant allocation of resources to corvettes, comprising 31.2% with 83 units, submarines, constituting 21.8% with 58 units, and mine-countermine warfare, making up 18% with 48 units. The remainder of the fleet exhibited a relatively even distribution, encompassing categories such as aircraft carriers 1 unit, cruisers and battle cruisers 5 units, destroyers 12 units, frigates 11 units, offshore patrol vessels 27 units, and amphibious assault support ships 21 units. The majority of Russian vessels were considered outdated and had been inherited from the USSR. The most prominent examples are the aircraft carrier Kuznetsov, which was 32 years old, the cruiser Moskva, which was 39, and the destroyer Vadim Kulikov, which was 40. As of February 24th, the Russian Federation's Black Sea Fleet comprised a total of 275 ships and vessels, with just 58 of them classified as combat ships. When considering patrol boats alongside combat vessels, the Black Sea Fleet's combined combat-capable units numbered 74 by February 2022. In the months leading up to the full-scale invasion, Russia systematically removed almost any naval assets that could potentially be used for a seaborne invasion. A total of 46 warships were redeployed from all of the Russian Federation's fleets to the Black and Azov Seas. Under the pretext of conducting large-scale exercises, the Kremlin effectively established a naval blockade along the Black Sea coastline of Ukraine from February 13th to 19th, 2022. The Mediterranean Sea also witnessed an unprecedented presence of Russian troops, consisting of 17 warships from all 4 Russian Federation fleets, including 2 missile cruisers, as well as an additional 7 missile ships of various types, including 2 missile submarines. But how have Russia's naval moves changed Ukraine's navy? During the initial phase of the Russian-Ukraine war and the occupation of Crimea in 2014, Russian forces seized 51 Ukrainian ships, accounting for 85% of the Ukrainian Navy fleet. Imagine how bad that was. By 2022, the Ukrainian Navy's active naval inventory consisted of only 15 units. The contemporary Ukrainian Navy heavily relied on its patrol force. The service faced significant deficiencies across various categories and domains, primarily comprising aging vessel ships in critical areas essential for naval effectiveness. For instance, their lone frigate, the Sahaydachny, is approaching 3 decades in service, while their single mine or countermine vessel has exceeded 35 years of service. Apart from a couple of landing craft, which have also significantly surpassed their intended service life, the service possesses a limited collection of offshore patrol vessels, OPVs. Among these OPVs, the youngest hulls are no more than 5 years old, while the oldest ones date back 4 decades. Okay, so Ukraine's fleet experienced significant losses right from the start. But what exactly happened? At the outset of the invasion, Russian warships were relocated to the Odessa area. Subsequently, Russian forces managed to seize control of Snake Island, Serpent Island or Zminy Island, a small yet strategically significant island southwest of Odessa. The valiant defense of the island by Ukrainian forces, along with the defiant phrase, "Russian warship, go F yourself," played a crucial role in bolstering the morale of Ukrainians who had endured heavy losses over an extended period. On March 3, 2022, Ukraine deliberately sank its frigate, the Sahaydachny, as it had encountered the ravages of war near the wells of a factory in Mykolaiv and was deemed unfit for further service. On the same day, another setback occurred for the Ukrainian fleet when the Ukrainian patrol vessel Slovyansk was sunk by a Russian Federation aircraft, struck by a Kh-31 missile. In early March, the patrol ship Korets and riverboat BK-02 Ackerman and BK-06 Visherod were also captured in Berdyansk. Likewise, in early March, BK-04 Kremenchuk and BK-05 Lubny were seized in Mariupol. The small reconnaissance ship A512 Pereyaslav likely sustained damage on the Dnipro River in late March 2022. The amphibious assault boat Stanislav was lost during a Ukrainian counterattack on the Zminy Island on May 7, 2022. The island was deoccupied at the beginning of July. Subsequently, in July 2022, the raid minesweeper Henichesk was sunk in a missile attack carried out by Russian aircraft. Another boat was hit on November 4, 2022. From that time until today, several other ships were also damaged. As a conclusion, the small Ukrainian fleet suffered huge losses. But it didn't give up at all. In spite of these achievements and the blockade of Ukrainian ports, the aggressor eventually faced consequences for their invasion. As of October 1, 2023, a total of 20 Russian ships and boats, along with one submarine, have been destroyed, marking two significant turning points on March 24 and April 14, 2022, that forever altered perceptions of the invincibility of the Russian fleet. On March 24, 2022, substantial damage was inflicted on the large amphibious ships Novocherkassk and Sezakunikov, while the large amphibious assault ship Saratov was completely destroyed. This incident resulted in numerous casualties and injuries among personnel, as well as damage to military equipment that had been transported by these ships to the occupied port of Berdyansk. Saratov came under attack from Ukrainian Tochka-U missiles, a Soviet tactical missile system originally designed for ground targets and not previously employed against ships. What a surprise! On the night of April 13th to April 14th, which was 21 days after the attack on the large amphibious ships in Berdyansk, the flagship of the Russian Federation's Black Sea Fleet, the Guard missile cruiser Moskva, came under attack. Let's delve into this particular incident in greater detail. So here's what happened. The ship met its demise when it was targeted by two Ukrainian-made Neptune missiles. The inaugural Neptune system, mounted on a new Tatra chassis, was assembled in August 2021 in preparation for Ukraine's 30th Independence Day parade. However, the first batch of missiles ordered by the state for the military didn't reach Odessa until February 20, 2022. Initial missile launches occurred promptly, prior to February 26, when three Russian amphibious ships departed from ports in Crimea and steered towards the Ukrainian coast in the Mykolaiv region. The Russians managed to intercept and neutralize all three missiles, but the realization that Ukraine possessed this missile capability prompted the ships to hastily return to Crimea. This development surprised the Russians since the Neptune missiles weren't scheduled to be in the armed forces' arsenal by late February. Following the failed launch, doubts arose regarding the missile's quality. In mid-March, experts from Kyiv conducted an inspection and discovered that all the missiles shared a single component failure, which had prevented them from detonating as intended. This issue was promptly rectified, and the Neptune missiles awaited an opportune moment for testing, which unexpectedly came on April 13th. You can't even imagine how lucky the Ukrainians were. Conventional radar indicated the presence of a significant target roughly 120 kilometers from the coast. In this sector of the Black Sea, only one object matched the size: the flagship of the Russian Federation's Black Sea Fleet, the cruiser Moskva. Due to dense clouds over the sea, the radar signal bounced off the clouds onto the water's surface and back to the clouds. The Russians were so confident in their invulnerability to Ukrainian forces that they likely hadn't even activated their air defense systems. Even if they had, the Neptune missiles would have posed formidable challenges for them. The Neptune is a slow-moving, liquid-fueled missile that approaches its target unnoticed until the very last moment, making it almost invisible to standard air defense systems as it skims over the water. It boasts a maximum flight range of up to 300 kilometers and a speed of 900 kilometers an hour, with a missile length of 5,050 millimeters and a launch weight of around 870 kilograms, including a 150 kilogram combat warhead. These specifications are more than sufficient for disabling combat surface ships and transport vessels weighing up to 5,000 tons. The missile is equipped with a cross-shaped folding wing, and its warhead is activated either upon target contact or remotely via non-contact sensors. The vacuum-packed warhead significantly enhances the explosive effect. The missile's homing warhead boasts ultra-wide viewing angles of plus 60 degrees, can identify and lock onto a target from a distance of 50 kilometers, and is highly resistant to enemy radar jamming. By comparison, the American Harpoon anti-ship missile has less robust characteristics, with viewing angles of plus 45 degrees. Thanks to the effective deployment of these two missiles, the missile cruiser Moskva was sunk. Following these events, Russia's diminishing capabilities became evident. The loss of the Moskva marked the most significant military setback for Russia in the war with Ukraine, given its residual value of $750 million. Beyond the financial and reputational losses, the Russian fleet also suffered strategic and tactical setbacks. After the sinking of the Moskva, which served as the air defense umbrella, 5 to 6 Russian ships in the Black Sea withdrew from the Ukrainian coast. Imagine how they felt. In early May 2022, Russia attempted to fortify the vulnerable garrison stationed on the captured Ukrainian island of Zmyny. However, after the loss of the Moskva and the retreat of the Russian fleet to Crimea, protecting Russian supply ships in the western part of the Black Sea became increasingly challenging. This vessel symbolized Russia's Black Sea fleet and was among the best in its class, boasting an impressive tonnage-to-armament ratio. Its primary mission involved engaging carrier groups, frigates, and cruisers using 16 Vulcan cruise missiles. The ship featured a Fort, or S-300 air defense system battery, torpedoes, and helicopters. The Moskva played a pivotal role in establishing an air defense umbrella through air target detection radar stations and missile systems. Other Russian ships in the naval group relied on the flagship's cover, as they lacked robust means of detecting and destroying targets. The absence of the cruiser at sea soon had significant repercussions. On May 2nd, 2 Russian patrol boats of Project 03160, Raptor, and the landing ship of Project 11770, Cerna, were struck by TB-2 Bayraktar drones near Snake Island. On May 5th, a Russian frigate of Project 11356R type Petrel caught fire near the Ukrainian island of Zmyny in the Black Sea, presumably after being hit by a Neptune missile. On May 7th, near Zmyny Island in the Black Sea, Ukrainian defenders destroyed a Russian Cerna-type boat. On June 17th, in the vicinity of the island, the Ukrainian Navy launched 2 Harpoon missiles, targeting the tugboat Lifeguard Vasil Bek. Although it was not sunk, the ship had to be towed to Sevastopol. Isolated from supplies and unable to sustain its defense of the island, the Russian garrison evacuated Zmyny on June 30th. With the loss of cruiser Moskva, along with its long-range missiles and the relinquishing of control over Zmyny Island, the Russian Black Sea Fleet's ability to deploy significant Russian amphibious forces and protect them against air and missile attacks was compromised. This means what? That Russia can no longer establish a coastal front along the western Ukrainian coast for an assault on the port of Odessa, which remains Ukraine's primary strategic maritime outlet. Prior to the effective use of anti-ship systems like Neptune and Harpoon, Russian ships would approach the coast from a distance of 18 to 25 miles and unleash artillery fire with impunity. The introduction of these weapons significantly altered Russia's tactics, as ships started to maintain a closer proximity to the Crimean Peninsula, avoiding any approach within 100 kilometers of the coastline under Ukrainian control. Both missile systems have an estimated range of approximately 174 miles when fired from the shore, covering nearly the entire northwestern portion of the Black Sea, but falling short of reaching the Russian Navy's base in Sevastopol. Following the acquisition of Grim-2 missiles by the Ukrainian armed forces, capable of covering a distance of 310 miles on a quasi-ballistic trajectory, and 2 naval drone attacks on the main base in Sevastopol, Russian missile carriers now venture to sea only when accompanied by boats, taking refuge near the southern coast of Crimea. Speaking of naval drones, they've been an absolute game-changer, altering not only the course of the Russo-Ukraine conflict, but also the landscape of modern warfare itself. And it is primarily Ukraine that deserves the credit for this monumental development. Naval drones have emerged as a notable innovation in this war. In the Black Sea, Ukraine has ushered in a new era of naval warfare with the use of suicide sea drones, armed with explosives designed to ram into targets and detonate upon impact. Scott Savitz, a senior analyst at the RAND Corporation, commented that Ukraine has employed these explosive uncrewed surface vessels, USVs, as formidable weapons against Russian fleets and even infrastructure. Savitz's analysis highlights that seafaring drones possess a unique capability to carry substantial explosive payloads and strike at the waterline of ships, rendering them more dangerous than aerial weapons like missiles and bombs. Furthermore, their relatively low cost allows Ukraine to execute attacks with a large number of drones, making them difficult to detect by Russian warships despite their scale. Ukraine initially employed sea drones in a significant attack in October 2022, targeting Russia's naval base in Sevastopol. Following this, Ukraine developed more sophisticated drones capable of carrying larger explosive payloads. In recent months, Ukrainian sea drones have successfully targeted a Russian warship near a naval port and a Russian oil tanker. Each drone costs only about $250,000, yet it has the potential to inflict damage on or destroy multi-million-dollar Russian vessels. As these drones are relatively new, they are compelling Russia to develop advanced defenses against them. How can Russia respond to such innovation? It needs to allocate additional resources to protect its ships, ports, and bridges, safeguarding its economy and troop resupply capability. These sea drones exemplify Ukraine's ingenuity in outsmarting a more powerful and better armed adversary. Throughout history, wars have often spurred innovations in naval technology. The American Civil War witnessed the debut of ironclad warships, while World War I introduced widespread submarine warfare. World War II demonstrated the superiority of aircraft carriers over battleships. The Russian-Ukrainian War showed how good the naval drones were. However, drones are better suited for attacking stationary targets such as ports, ships at anchor, and hydraulic structures. Targeting fast and maneuverable ships presents greater challenges, requiring constant location updates. And although 154 pounds of explosives might damage a corvette or frigate, it's unlikely to destroy them. So Ukraine started to develop more advanced drones. Civilian vessels loaded with military equipment make more effective targets, as they are slower and typically follow predictable routes. Instances of attacks on warships in the open sea have also been reported. You can't even imagine what a success that was. In May 2023, drones struck the Russian reconnaissance ship Ivan Kurs. On the night of July 25th, the Russian Ministry of Defense reported an attempted attack on the patrol ship Sergei Kotov, which was believed to have been dispatched by the Russians to intercept civilian vessels. Some drones have the range to project force across the entire Black Sea. In November, they targeted the oil terminal at Novorossiysk, which was only 546 yards from the submarine parking area, as noted by naval expert Volodymyr Zablotsky of Defense Express. He emphasized that the Black Sea lacks safe havens for the enemy. Currently, Ukraine is developing and using various models of maritime drones. We'll tell you about some of them. The new underwater drone Marichka, which passes the first tests. The drone is designed to attack surface and underwater targets, bridges, and coastal fortifications. If necessary, an unmanned ship can transport cargo, for which it is equipped with several compartments, or engage in reconnaissance. Length 6.56 yards, width 1.09 yards, range 621 miles, price about $400,000. Another drone is the Magura V5 surface drone, length 6 yards, width 1.64 yards, height above the waterline 0.54 yards, cruising speed 22 knots, 25.28 miles per hour, maximum speed 42 knots, 48.5 miles an hour, range 517.6 miles, and payload 705 pounds. Magura V5 is controlled via satellite or radio. The marine drone is equipped with a video camera and broadcasts video from it online. The drone is multifunctional. In addition to hitting targets, it can carry out reconnaissance, surveillance, patrolling, security, and demining. Controlling a drone does not require a complex infrastructure. Only a control panel comparable in size to a laptop is required. In addition to the operator, the device is serviced by several other people. Despite the considerable weight, no special construction is required to launch the drone on the water. A special feature of Magura V5 is the ability to work in a swarm of 3 drones. At the same time, the main one of them has hardware differences. Probably the additional equipment is a signal repeater. The Sea Baby drone is assembled underground at the factory in Ukraine. Payload 992 to 1,874 pounds. Range at least 435 miles. In addition to the Crimean Bridge, the drones successfully destroyed the large amphibious ship Olenogorsky Gornyak and the Russian tanker Sig. Naval drones allow you to effectively disable enemy ships and other targets in and near the water. The armed forces proved effective in sea battles despite the actual absence of a fleet. There are a few enemy ships compared to other types of equipment, so disabling each one is a great achievement. The Russians destroy up to 70% of naval drones, but the remaining 30% cause them significant problems. You know they'll cause it. The cost of the drone and the ship is incomparable. The creation of a separate brigade of naval drones indicates a large number of them are in service. First in world history, Ukraine creates a fleet of maritime drones, which has already compelled the Russians to conceal their ships. President Volodymyr Zelensky announced this development at the International Forum of Defense Industries on September 30, 2023. Currently, there are 134 types of maritime drones worldwide, but most are reconnaissance or training models. Ukrainian drones stand out for their pioneering effectiveness in actual combat operations at sea as a component of full-scale warfare. Although Ukraine's pioneering use of sea drones may not necessarily shift the tide of war, it could have a similar transformative effect. Ukraine's attack on Sevastopol marked the world's first instance of combining sea and aerial drones in warfare. They were also successfully combined with long-range missiles. Drones are a key component of the Ukrainian Mosquito fleet concept. This is the concept that fast and maneuverable warships can deal significant damage to larger enemy ships, thereby being more effective. Currently, naval drones can serve at least 3 roles: demining the coastal zone, conducting maritime reconnaissance, particularly near Crimea, and executing force projection and strike missions. Ultimately, we can say that long-range anti-ship missiles and naval drones force the Russian fleet to retreat as far as possible to those safe zones that still remain. Currently, Ukraine is working on destroying Russian air defense systems, ships near Crimea, and headquarters. Due to the latest tactics, the entire potential of the Russian fleet is being destroyed. Do you think an effective weapon against naval drones will be invented, or is that an end to the Navy? What do you think will be the water war in the future? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. How incompetent can Putin get? Since the war in Ukraine started, he's been losing tanks by the dozens on a daily level. His military has been unable to deliver powerful air and artillery strikes or apply modern military tactics and strategies, and the list doesn't stop there. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the world's attention was naturally riveted on the land war. There, Russia's poor command structure and logistical incompetence became apparent within the first week, with the attack on Kyiv stalling. Since then, Russia has been forced to take hundreds of thousands of casualties in a war of attrition that has raged for 20 months and counting. However, Russia's incompetence has extended to the seas as well. In the build-up to the conflict and early stages of the war, military observers feared that Russia would quickly take control of the seas and stage an amphibious attack on Odessa, Ukraine's 3rd largest city. If Russia took Odessa, it would essentially cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea entirely and leave it a poor, landlocked rump state. Such fears proved unfounded. A landing near Odessa never came. Instead, the biggest stories involving Russia's navy in this war have been of its numerous humiliations. What happened? Today, Russia has essentially ceded control of the western Black Sea and is increasingly not even safe within its haven in Crimea. But why has the Russian navy proven so ineffective in the war? To be as fair as we can to Russia, it is and always has been in a bad geostrategic position with regards to the sea. Ever since the days of Peter the Great, Russia has aspired to be a sea power. However, geography makes this difficult to do, as its ports are either contained within choke points, freeze over in the winter, or both. The quest for improved access to the sea has been a vital objective for Russia's foreign policy since the early 18th century, and Russia has never quite been able to achieve this goal. Even at the height of its power during the Soviet Union, unrestricted access to the sea was an objective that still eluded Moscow. In this light, it is understandable why Russia places such a high strategic importance on Crimea, and why it was willing to use military force to secure it. It is one of Russia's few warm water ports. Unfortunately for the Russians, there's a problem. The Turks command the transit points between the Black and Mediterranean seas through their control of the Bosporus and Dardanelles. This control was formalized through the 1936 Montreux Convention regarding the regime of the Straits. The convention allows complete freedom of transit for the commercial vessels of any country through these straits during peacetime. In times of war, however, Turkey, if it is not a party to the conflict, can close the straits to transiting ships unless they are returning to their bases. 3 days after Russia invaded Ukraine, Turkey invoked the Montreux Convention's wartime provisions for the first time, refusing Russian naval vessels in the Mediterranean access to the Black Sea. For example, at the end of November 2022, 2 Russian warships left the Mediterranean through the Suez Canal after 9 months of idling after Turkey forbid them from transiting through the Dardanelles and Bosporus to the Black Sea. The effect of the Montreux Convention has been to cut off Russia's ability to reinforce its Black Sea fleet. For Ukraine, this was a significant piece of diplomatic aid. It immediately made Russian naval officers more cautious, knowing that every ship in the fleet was precious. Even so, it seemed far-fetched that Ukraine would be able to significantly impede the operations of the Russian Black Sea fleet. That opinion quickly started to change, however. Ukraine proved its ability to strike at the Russian Navy early in the war. 3 days after it invaded Ukraine, and on the same day the Turks invoked the Montreux Convention, Russia captured the strategically important port of Berdyansk. The Ukrainian military and Western observers were understandably concerned that the Russian ships that piled into Berdyansk could either land troops in the rear of Ukraine's southern lines or attack Odessa. Then, at about 7:45 a.m. on March 24th, exactly a month after the invasion, the landing craft Saratov mysteriously exploded and sank in port at Berdyansk. Ships of the Saratov's class, the Alligator-class tank landing ship, can land up to 425 soldiers or marines, with armored support of either 40 infantry fighting vehicles or 20 tanks. The loss of this vessel was thus a significant blow to Russia's ability to conduct amphibious operations. How did this happen? From the beginning of the conflict, NATO has provided Ukraine with excellent intelligence, and Ukraine's intelligence units got the word that the Saratov was loaded with munitions at the time of the attack. Ukraine used this intelligence and a Cold War-era Tochka-U Scarab short-range ballistic missile to carry out the deed. The Tochka-U has a range of about 120 kilometers. We do not know how many of these missiles Ukraine used in the attack, but what is known is that Russia's modern air defense systems should have easily been able to intercept these Soviet weapons. Russian media at the time reported that its forces had done just that, although the real story came in July, when the Saratov was raised from the depths of the sea. Russia's supposedly modern air defense network failed to act against a much older weapons system. Meanwhile, 2 other ships, the Seyza-Kunikov and Novocherkassk, were seen on video departing from the flaming Saratov. They also suffered damage in the attack and were forced to retreat to Crimea. 11 sailors on board the Saratov died in the incident. Ukraine's next assault on the Russian Navy would become the most famous of the war. This was the sinking of the cruiser Moskva, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, in April 2022. This incident was apparently so humiliating for Russia that its Ministry of Defense still offers no details about what happened and avoids talking about it in public, to the point that the families of the sailors on board are still left in the dark about the fates of their loved ones. How exactly this incident unfolded is still unclear. After the successful attack, American sources reported that the Ukrainians had used liquid-fueled Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles, sending them to coordinates provided by US intelligence by way of a P-8 Poseidon maritime surveillance aircraft that flew out of Italy and looked around the Black Sea. Ukraine denied this report, however. According to the Ukrainians, April 13, 2022 was the worst day to sink the cruiser because the weather was so bad for such a precise, premeditated attack. The coastline was covered with low, dark rain clouds on that day. The Ukrainian radars in the area had a limited 18-kilometer range because of the bad weather. Knowing this, the Moskva's crew got a wee bit careless. According to Ukrainian sources, at the time of the invasion we had no over-the-horizon radars and Russia knew it. But since the clouds were very low and a signal in this corridor between the water and the clouds had nowhere to go, the radar suddenly reached and identified Moskva. The ship's crew seemingly ignored this potentially deadly situation and were so lax about their security that the air defense systems were inactive. They had not noticed that they had just sailed to within the Neptune's 200-kilometer range. Ukraine may have at this point used a Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drone to distract the Moskva and then launch the missiles. For a while after the attack, Ukrainian crews did not know what happened, but radar soon revealed that 4 Russian ships were rushing to the Moskva from different directions. Later, the Ukrainians realized that a tugboat had also been dispatched from Crimea, hoping to save the ailing ship. At this point, the weather cooperated again too. When a storm began at sea and made rescue operations much harder, it became impossible to save the Moskva then, and it sank beneath the waves. Hundreds of Russian sailors reportedly saw their flagship get hit by 2 Neptune missiles. The Moskva incident is more baffling because the ship was an air defense cruiser. If running properly, The Moskva should have gotten as much as 4 minutes of warning that the Ukrainian cruise missiles were on their way. The Russian cruiser also had a triple layer of protection against such air attacks. Its defenses included the S-300F surface-to-air missiles, 9K-33 OSA air defense missiles, AK-360 close-in 30mm cannons, chaff, decoys, and electronic defense systems. However, no one recorded the Moskva using any of these systems against the Ukrainian cruise missiles. The ship just sat there. Why were none of these systems active? Was the ship's radar system defective? We might never know the answer. Whatever the reason, the Moskva was the largest Russian vessel sunk since World War II, and the first loss of a Russian flagship since the Russo-Japanese War. Russia says that 18 crew members died. Other sources say it was as many as 600. Either way, the incident shocked the Kremlin. With Ukraine's demonstrated anti-ship capabilities and no way for it to bring replacements thanks to the Turks' invocation of the Montreux Convention, Russia became even more cautious about how it would use its naval assets. Since this incident, the Black Sea Fleet has been bottled up around its base in Sevastopol, Crimea. With this knowledge, Ukrainian troops confidently strode forward with their Kherson counteroffensive between August and November of 2022, safe in the knowledge that the Russian Navy would not be bothering them with missile attacks from the Black Sea, let alone amphibious operations behind their lines. Even with the Russian Navy's retreat to the relatively safe Crimea, Ukraine wasn't done showing off its prowess in sinking ships. Next up was the rescue tug Vasily Bek. While far less spectacular a target than the Moskva, these tugs are important to the maintenance of a naval fleet. This role is especially important in the Black Sea due to Russia's inability to reinforce its fleet. This ship was new too, being launched in 2016 and commissioned in 2017. On June 17, 2022, Ukrainian forces attacked the Vasily Bek when it was on its way to resupply Russian soldiers stationed on Snake Island, a place already made famous from the start of the war, when the garrison there used colorful language in response to Russia's demands for surrender. The Ukrainians hit the Vasily Bek with 2 Harpoon anti-ship cruise missiles. The ship stood no chance and went down, with about 10 Russian KIA in the incident and a $25 million Tor air defense system on board that was supposed to be placed on the island. On June 30th, Russia evacuated its garrison from Snake Island. Moscow claimed that this move was an act of goodwill in recognition of a humanitarian corridor that was part of its grain export deal with Ukraine. In reality, Russia evacuated its troops from Snake Island because the attack on the Vasily Bek made its military brass realize that it's too risky to reinforce and resupply the outpost. It was a tacit admission that Russia had ceded the Black Sea west of Crimea to Ukraine. But the Ukrainians weren't done yet. The Olenigorsky Gornyak, a Rapucha-class landing ship, was Ukraine's next target. On August 4, 2023, Ukraine used drone boats to swarm the ship and its neighbors when it was docked in the Black Sea port of Novorossiysk. Not all the drones made it through Russian defenses, but the attack on the Olenigorsky Gornyak succeeded. The ship did not sink, but it needed to be put in a dry dock to repair the heavy damage. It's unlikely that the ship will return to action anytime soon. The water drone Ukraine used in the attack was a new low-visibility grey boat that can be operated via remote control. The drone boat has a high payload, able to carry a 300-kilogram warhead up to a range of 800 kilometers. The boat also features a satellite communications array at its rear. A Ukrainian operator of these drones explained their low profile was designed to exploit weaknesses in Russian ship defenses. It was an adaptation from their earlier attacks, where Russian ships spotted drone boats and sank them with artillery and small arms fire once they got to within visual range. The attack on the Olenigorsky Gornyak reveals that Ukraine has absorbed these lessons and is adapting with its newer drone boats. Russia claims that it foiled a similar attack on an oil facility after this incident, but as always, these claims should be treated with skepticism. Most recently, Ukraine attacked targets in Sevastopol, the headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, and other targets in Crimea. On September 13th, Ukrainian forces struck the Sergo-Ordzhonikidze shipyard in Sevastopol, a major repair base. Ukraine reportedly used 10 Franco-British Storm Shadow cruise missiles in the attack. Russia's Ministry of Defense claims that air defense systems in the area shot 7 of these missiles down, but that effort was clearly not enough. The Russian Kilo-class diesel-electric submarine Rostov-on-Don and the large landing ship Minsk were struck and destroyed by the Storm Shadows. Key infrastructure on the base was also damaged in this incident, However, the missile attack was only the climax of the operation. Other units were essential for shaping it. Prior to the attack, Ukrainian special operators seemed to have destroyed one of Russia's nearby S-400 air defense systems and took control of an oil facility that housed a local radar unit. By downing these systems, the Ukrainians set the stage for the strike on Sevastopol. It would only be the first of several attacks on Crimean targets in the weeks ahead. On September 14th, Ukraine again struck at the Russian Navy on the seas. Its general staff said it had targeted 2 ships in the western Black Sea and released a video showing a Russian patrol ship appearing to come under attack by drone boats. The Russian Ministry of Defense confirmed that one of its ships, the Sergei Kotov, had been attacked, but repelled the assault. Meanwhile, that same day, Ukrainian forces used cruise missiles and drones to destroy a Russian air defense network in the Crimean city of Yevpatoria. Then, on September 22nd, Ukraine launched another attack on Sevastopol. Ukraine sent several Storm Shadow cruise missiles at targets there. Russia claims that it shot most of them down, but one made it through, hitting the Black Sea Fleet's headquarters. The attack set the main building ablaze, and Russian officials said at least one service member went missing in the aftermath. Ukraine alleges that the strike was timed to coincide with a meeting of high-level Russian officials. Kirilo Budanov, Ukraine's intelligence chief, says that 2 Russian commanders were badly injured in the attack. Later, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces said the strike had killed Viktor Sokolov, the commander of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, along with 33 others. No independent source verified this claim, however. Sokolov reportedly attended a soccer awards ceremony to prove he was not dead on September 27th, although there are claims that this was a duplicate. As always, we should know more in time. What we do know is that the Institute for the Study of War confirmed an attack on the 744th Communications Center of the Command of the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. And the problems are only piling on for Russia. In late September, the Biden administration seemingly finally gave Ukraine what it has wanted for so long. Although it was not officially announced, it's likely that Ukraine will be getting ATACMS missiles in the near future. These weapons can hit targets up to 300 kilometers away, 50 kilometers further than the Storm Shadow. And unlike the Storm Shadow, which requires a riskier launch from a fighter jet, ATACMS can be fired from Ukraine's HIMARS platforms on the ground. ATACMS would be ideal for launching attacks on Sevastopol. Meanwhile, if Ukraine gets ATACMS, it's also possible that Germany will agree to supply Ukrainians with Taurus air-launched cruise missiles that have even greater range than ATACMS. This weapon system would be ideal for targeting the Kerch Bridge connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland. A drone attack already damaged the Kerch Bridge a year ago. This scenario would be far more threatening. Ukraine has renewed its attacks on Crimea for a few reasons. First, Russia has allowed the grain export deal that Turkey and the UN brokered in July 2022 to expire. Russia's Black Sea Fleet has resumed its blockade of such exports, making it a more important target for Ukraine to destroy. Crimea is also the linchpin of Russia's logistics in Ukraine. Being able to resupply its troops from Crimea is vital to the Russian war effort. Ukrainian disruption of Russian Navy logistics from Crimea is one of the reasons why Moscow now considers it too dangerous to send ships to the west of the peninsula. An attack on Russia's ports in Crimea would disrupt the supply chain to all the branches of Russia's military, and it appears that the Black Sea Fleet is helpless in stopping such attacks. Crimea is also a highly political target, with Ukrainian President Zelensky saying that this war started in Crimea and will end in Crimea. The recapture of Crimea would be the greatest victory for the Ukrainian military, a highly symbolic measure of its triumph. The stakes are just as high, or even higher, for Putin. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, he sold his occupation and annexation of Crimea to the Russian public as his crowning foreign policy achievement. If Russian occupation of Crimea becomes untenable through missile and drone attacks, and supplying the Russian forces in other parts of Ukraine from Crimea also becomes untenable, Putin's political position at home erodes, and the entire Russian war effort risks breaking down. The war has already put Russia through isolation, economic hardship, and hundreds of thousands of casualties. If Russia cannot gain anything from the hostilities and winds up losing Crimea too, or if it at least cannot use the peninsula for strategic purposes, it's difficult to see how Putin would be able to remain in power, which he plans to do until at least 2036. In this scenario, Russian elites may decide that the time is right for their country to finally get a new leader. There is a presidential election in Russia in 2024. Although elections in Russia are only formalities, The 2024 election could serve as a pretext to oust Putin from power if the war goes too poorly between now and then. It's understandable why Crimea and the Black Sea Fleet would become an increasingly high priority for Ukraine. All wars are first and foremost political. Even if things don't turn out that way, Ukraine's effective neutralization of the Russian Black Sea Fleet is an astounding military achievement. Early in the war, Ukraine forced the Black Sea Fleet to retreat to what it believed was the safety of Crimea. Now, through the actions of its intelligence units, special operators, and missile and air units, it's showing that not even Crimea is safe. If ATACMS and Taurus missiles soon arrive, that point will only be made clearer. What do you think will come next in the war at sea? Will Ukraine soon use ATACMS missiles to destroy Russian ships and docks in Sevastopol? Is the Kerch Bridge safe for Russia? Let us know what you think in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. First tanks and now submarines. Putin can't seem to keep hold of his weapons, with Russia's only aircraft carrier catching fire not once, not twice, but 3 times since 2018, and his guided missile cruiser the Moskva sinking in 2022. Russia's navy, widely considered one of the most powerful in the world, has seen better days, and now Russia's submarine power is under serious threat. Here's why. It's no secret that things haven't been going well for Russia. From crushing sanctions to staggering military casualties, Putin's invasion of Ukraine has backfired in a host of unexpected ways. It has also highlighted profound weaknesses in Russia's military capabilities, exposing them as aging, corrupt, and poorly led. Nowhere is this more true than at sea. Despite statements by former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev back in 2009 that, without a navy, Russia does not have a future as a state, the country's surface fleet remains embarrassingly inept. Former US Navy Admiral James G. Foggo recently noted that it has been allowed to atrophy due to factors like poor maintenance, low funding, and corruption. This trend has been on full display during recent years, with the Russian Navy suffering a number of embarrassing high-profile mishaps. Its only aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov, nicknamed the unluckiest ship in the world, has caught fire at least 3 times since 2018. Earlier this year, Ukrainian intelligence assessed that the ship is in critical condition and not capable of moving under its own power. That's not to mention the sinking of Russia's Black Sea flagship, the Moskva, in April 2022. But now there's an even bigger problem for Putin, one deep below the waves. For all the issues with its surface fleet, Russia's current fleet of 58 submarines have been long considered among the most powerful in the world. This includes 11 nuclear-powered ballistic missile subs, 17 nuclear-powered attack subs, and 9 nuclear-powered cruise missile subs, with several more on the way next year. While they haven't been a factor in Ukraine, they are still considered a critical threat by the US military. However, their power may not last forever. Recent reports suggest that Russia's submarine capabilities are being seriously harmed by the backlash to its invasion, especially through the crippling effect of Western sanctions. So what does that mean for the future of the Russian military? And just how serious of a blow could it be to Putin's war machine? To understand just how critical Putin's submarine problem could be, we first need to take a quick look at some Russian naval history, which, funnily enough, is permeated with continuing and humiliating losses of fleets. But wait, there's a plot twist, and it occurs just after World War II. Russia has had military power at sea in one form or another since 1696, when Peter the Great first established the Imperial Russian Navy. Impressed by his visits to Western Europe, Peter realized that Russia could never be a true great power while remaining landlocked. By 1710, he had over 58 ships in his fleet, and despite some defeats, by Peter's death in 1725, Russia was the dominant sea power in the Baltic. During the reign of Catherine the Great, the empire's ambitions at sea had grown, establishing a new Black Sea fleet and annexing Crimea for the first time in 1783. By the time of her death in 1796, Russia possessed the world's largest navy after Britain. This period was the height of Russia's imperial naval power. As naval historian Robert A. Theobald once put it, "To my mind, the death of Catherine marks the high watermark in Russian naval history." From this date to the end of the Imperial Navy, it was on a treadmill working hard but getting nowhere. This became obvious during the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, where Russia suffered a stinging defeat to the combined forces of the Ottomans, France, and Britain. The shortcomings of the Imperial Navy were even more obvious by the time of the 1904–1905 Russo-Japanese War. But it gets worse. In response to Russian expansionism in the Far East, the newly industrialized Japanese military gave Russian Tsar Nicholas II a humiliating defeat at sea. The war marked Japan's emergence as a great power and contributed heavily to the First Russian Revolution of 1905. Following the Second Revolution in 1917, what remained of the old Imperial Navy came under control of the Soviet Union. And while Lenin and Stalin both aimed to rebuild a powerful Soviet Navy, it remained largely inept throughout both world wars and into the early 1950s. As Theobald described it in his well-known 1953 presentation at the US Naval War College, this is the history of a navy which has lost more complete fleets than any other navy in the world. It is the history of a navy which has never been more than second-rate, that has never been decisive in world history, and that has never developed a depth of tradition to compare with those of the Western navies. But this would change drastically only a few years after his assessment, mainly due to one factor: modern submarines. While Russia had some early submarines before World War II, the first modern Soviet ballistic missile submarines were completed in the late 1950s. These early Soviet models were diesel-electric and based on designs pioneered by the Germans, similar to the United States. However, by 1960, the Soviet Navy had launched its first nuclear-powered attack submarines, giving the USSR below-surface capabilities greater than perhaps any country except the US. Soon after, the Soviets also developed nuclear SSGN-class subs, running on nuclear power but designed to launch limited ballistic missile strikes against American aircraft carriers and other naval deployments. Over the next 3 decades, the Soviet Navy continued to build and maintain a large fleet of submarines, relying on them heavily to challenge America's greater military strength during the Cold War. Because the true names of Soviet subs were rarely known abroad, most are still referred to by NATO codenames, such as the Alpha-class nuclear subs. These use liquid metal-cooled reactor propulsion systems and titanium hulls, enabling them to move extremely fast, over 43 knots or 80 kilometers an hour, at an operational depth of 2,000 feet or 600 meters. Also important to Soviet deterrence and power projection were the Typhoon-class subs. The largest submarines ever built, Typhoons are over 563 feet or 172 meters long, have a beam of 81 feet or 25 meters, and can carry up to 20 Sturgeon nuclear-capable ballistic missiles. These were just a few of the many varieties of subs developed by the Soviet Navy, and the Soviets also continued heavily building diesel-electric models as well, such as the Kilo-class attack subs and others. The fleet was never able to make the switch to fully nuclear-powered, largely due to budgetary and technological constraints. However, by its peak in 1980, the USSR's submarine force had 480 boats, including 71 fast attack and 94 cruise and ballistic missile submarines. Even following the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, this submarine fleet remained a major part of Russia's naval power. Dmitry Gorenberg of the Center for Naval Analyses has noted that during the post-Cold War period, Putin has focused on developing new submarine capabilities, while Russia has essentially lost the ability to construct new, advanced surface vessels. The most advanced of these submarine developments are the Yasen and updated Yasen M-class SSGNs. Developed in the 1990s and early 2000s, RAND Corporation researcher Edward Geist has described these as the crown jewel of the contemporary Russian Navy, and perhaps the pinnacle of present-day Russian military technology. And according to Admiral Foggo, one major advantage of the Yasen-class vessels is that they are very quiet, which is the most important thing in submarine warfare. They can also carry both Zircon hypersonic and long-range Kalibr cruise missiles. Yet these deadly subs also come with a hefty price tag. The Severodvinsk, the first Yasen-class model, reportedly cost over $1.6 billion. While this is still much cheaper than the US's most advanced subs, it is a very high price tag considering Russia's far smaller economy. In the past few years, Putin's government has also claimed that even more nuclear subs are in the works, including what Russian state media claim to be a new division of submarines carrying nuclear-capable super torpedoes in the coming years. Nick Childs, Senior Fellow for Naval Forces and Maritime Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, has argued that investments in submarines up to this point are one of the only things which has allowed Russia to maintain its status among the leading powers. While its fleet is still far smaller than during the Soviet era, Childs points out that it remains very capable, and along with some of the older submarines, would still pose a threat to NATO, both at sea and against land-based targets. But even before the war in Ukraine, there were some doubts about the true effectiveness of Russia's impressive-seeming subs. While they are doubtless in better shape than its surface fleet, they have never been truly tested in combat. So how are Putin's submarine fleets faring in the Russo-Ukraine conflict? On land, the reckless nature of Russian military doctrine has been on full display in the invasion of Ukraine. But despite the enormous losses by Russia's ground forces, its navy has so far played a very limited role in the conflict. This includes its submarines, which have remained mostly as a nuclear deterrent and threat. The exception to this is Russia's Black Sea Fleet, where submarines off the coast of Sevastopol and Novorossiysk have been used to fire Kalibr missiles into Ukraine. None of these subs have so far been damaged or destroyed, and there are still concerns that they could be used to counter NATO activity and control trade routes in the Black Sea. But the consequences of Putin's invasion have created a different kind of problem for the Russian Navy and its submarines. The crushing regime of Western sanctions imposed on Russia has begun to erode the country's ability to resupply and maintain its military industry. And in December of 2022, the US State Department added even more sanctions directly targeting Russia's naval power. These have already begun to work, cutting Russia off from the technology required in modern subs. As Admiral Foggo told Newsweek in an interview, "I think they have been severely crippled by these economic sanctions and by their own foolishness in the war in Ukraine. In particular, the maintenance of existing subs and development of new ones will become increasingly difficult since, when they don't have the raw materials, they can't sustain the industrial base. They don't have the manpower, because that manpower is going into fighting the war in Ukraine." Military losses and brain drain make it likely that Russia will lose its ability to compete with Western countries in submarine development, especially when it comes to their ability to project power. Graham P. Hurd of the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies argues that the protracted nature of the conflict and the coming Ukrainian counter-offensive undercuts Russian military credibility. The repeated military failures in Ukraine have created growing pressure in Russia to project an image of strength through its submarines. In turn, this has incentivized the Russian Navy to take greater risks by using submarines which are not seaworthy and fast-tracking new weapon systems without proper testing. Hurd added that submarines are the most expensive ticket item in Russia's military budget and have no obvious utility in this war. So Russia compensates and projects power through acceptance of greater risk. As a consequence, Russia's submarines will suffer indirect and long-term damage the longer the war lasts. Similarly, Hurd and other experts have pointed out that the sanctions illustrate just how much of Russia's military-industrial complex was, and remains, reliant on critical Western technology. Without the advanced components for submarines manufactured in the US, UK, France, Germany, and elsewhere, Russian development will be seriously stunted in the years to come. And there are almost no alternatives to the technology which sanctions have cut Russia off from. Parts from China and Iran, for example, are not advanced enough to meet Moscow's requirements. While experts remain divided on just how dependent Russia's nuclear submarines are on Western tech, it's pretty clear that at least some of the imported components are necessary to build new vessels. These are mostly thought to be technologically advanced electronic components for guidance, communication, and missile deployment. Russian defense journalist Alexander Timokhin wrote in January that the sanctions imposed on Russia after the special military operation left a sharp imprint on the country's technological capabilities. The production of radar complexes, communication systems, guided missiles, sonar equipment, and other similar systems has proved to be difficult. As a consequence, these restrictions could make it nearly impossible to build Yasen and Yasen M-class subs and other highly capable boats. Childs from the International Institute for Strategic Studies points out that this trajectory is already visible, as while the newest Russian submarines are very capable, Russia's inefficient shipbuilding industry has struggled to deliver them on time and in significant numbers. Like other experts, he agrees that Russia's construction shortfalls will accelerate in the coming months and years, since this could well be exacerbated by the increased demands on other sectors of the defense industry as a result of the war, as well as from the impact of sanctions on certain key components. So what do these deficiencies mean for Putin's ambitions and the future of the Russian military? Well, experts have outlined two main possible scenarios for the future of Russia's submarine fleet. One possibility is that as military resource constraints continue to grow, it will lead to prioritization of the elements which have been most impacted, especially ground forces. As of May 2023, Russia has lost nearly 200,000 soldiers, a truly staggering figure for a modern military. In turn, as one analyst put it, that will inevitably lead to cuts, or limits at least, in shipbuilding in the future. The other possibility is that Russia will be forced to funnel more investment into submarines due to their relative importance and strategic value. This will mean less and less resources for replenishing ground troops and equipment, which are both cheaper and more expendable. But even if Putin opts for the second scenario, any money spent now is likely to have a delayed impact. Past investments in submarine development and maintenance will carry the Russian fleet for at least a few more years to come, but within 5 to 10 years, it could be a very different picture. Just based on the size and current capabilities of Russian submarines, it will likely remain one of the world's most powerful fleets for the next decade. But after that, things are far more uncertain. Any modern submarine which breaks down in the years could become essentially useless, reduced to just so much expensive scrap metal. However Putin attempts to manage his growing economic constraints, the main role of Russian submarines will probably remain as a nuclear deterrent. And there are also some indications that Putin has already realized just how spread thin his resources really are. In March, Russia's Pacific Fleet underwent a series of military drills which were described as a surprise inspection of more than a dozen submarines, potentially signaling a lack of faith by the Kremlin in the readiness or maintenance of the fleet. Readouts from the Kremlin show that Putin recently told Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu that while Russia's priorities remain the war in Ukraine, still, the objective to develop the Navy, including in the Pacific Theater of Operations, remains relevant. Adding that, it is clear that some of the fleet's assets can be used in conflicts elsewhere. This indicates both that Putin does not believe submarines can make much of a difference in Ukraine, and that they remain most useful as a nuclear deterrent. As Russia's submarines begin to break down in the coming years, with no easy way to maintain them or build new state-of-the-art models, the country will also become less able to project power in this way. This will almost certainly happen, regardless of where the Kremlin prioritizes resources, especially since casualties in Ukraine show no sign of slowing down. As losses climb higher and higher, and as sanctions continue their squeeze, it may also provoke Putin into even more aggressive and reckless strategies. In fact, there is evidence that this is already taking place. In the past few months, Russia has deployed submarines in increasingly threatening positions. As Michael Peterson, the director of the Russia Maritime Studies Institute, told Newsweek, "We have indications that nuclear-powered submarines have been deploying off the coast of the United States and into the Mediterranean and elsewhere along Europe periphery, in ways that mirror Soviet-style submarine deployments in the Cold War." Such aggressive posturing is likely tied to Putin's growing issues in an attempt to project a facade of Russia as a true global power, despite an economy less than half the size of California. This weakness is also reflected in overly optimistic predictions for its military-industrial complex. A recent analysis by the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, concluded, similarly to other experts, that Russian officials continue to claim that Russian defense manufacturers are increasing production amidst ongoing indications that the Russian Defense Industrial Base (DIB) is unable to meet Russia's long-term economic and military goals. There have been rosy claims by officials like Alexei Rachmanov, head of the Russian United Shipbuilding Company, that submarine production time will soon be cut by 8 to 13 months. But there is little evidence to support this, and in another sign of growing weakness, Putin signed a decree on February the 27th, reducing previous plans to construct at least 3 nuclear reactor-equipped Leida-class icebreakers by 2035 down to just a single vessel. Again, this likely reflects the fact that the need to replenish the stocks of conventional ground weaponry lost in Ukraine will likely consume the majority of Russia's DIB and limit Russia's ability to produce systems aimed at longer-term strategic goals. This includes both nuclear icebreakers and submarines, indicating that Russia's resources are spread much thinner than Putin would like the world to believe. So, to sum up, despite the claims by the Kremlin, there are strong signs that Russia's disastrous strategy in Ukraine has backfired even more than we know. The squeeze of Western sanctions now threatens to render even the deadly Russian submarine fleet obsolete. The longer the war goes on and the more isolated Russia becomes, the harder it will be to obtain the advanced components needed for these vessels. This will continue to erode the country's industrial base, possibly crippling all long-term defense production. And because Russian losses in Ukraine are so heavy, Putin also faces a crisis of credibility and growing pressure to project a facade of power. This has already led to reckless, aggressive posturing by Russian subs and a willingness to use vessels which are not even seaworthy, a problem which seems likely to increase. Because the Russian Navy has historically been so reliant on them to project power, there is little question that the stagnation of its submarine fleet will be a serious blow in the coming years. But what do you think? Will sanctions and battlefield losses eventually doom Russia's submarine fleet? Or can Putin find a way around these issues and keep Russia as a great power? Let us know what you think in the comments section below. And don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis.
Putin's invasion of Ukraine is a disaster, and it's no wonder. The man is a paranoid megalomaniac who goes around poisoning his opposition's underpants, uses outdated Soviet-era weapons and tactics on the battlefield, and isolates himself from the world to a degree that is clearly eating away at his sanity. And that's not all. If you haven't heard this before, we're here to talk about it today. Putin is a thief. While there are numerous military mistakes that Russian generals and armies have made, the mistakes begin at the top with Putin himself. No surprise there, right? But you may be surprised at just how vast and crazy this sea of mistakes, dirty little secrets, and even just basic stupidity really is. Here's the scoop. You can tell how big a thief Vladimir Putin is by how many articles and documentaries have been made about how he's stolen Russia blind. One pertinent article is literally titled just that, Stealing Russia Blind, written by Harley Balzer and published in the Journal of Democracy. In the article, Balzer points out that Putin has established a sistema, the Russian word for an established and accepted system, based on massive predation that has produced the most unequal wealth distribution in any developed economy. Estimates have suggested that Putin and his oligarch cronies have stolen more than $1 trillion worth from the Russian economy since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. But that is just the beginning of Putin's kleptocracy story. Putin's experience with government-level theft started early, long before he reached Russia's throne, when he managed to steal $124 million worth of funding that was designed to feed the starving population of St. Petersburg in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1996, he was able to protect his boss, St. Petersburg Mayor Anatoly Sobchak, when Sobchak lost an election over a corruption scandal and fled the country, an escape arranged by Putin himself. That ability to protect his corrupt friends is what garnered attention by the equally corrupt Russian President Boris Yeltsin in 1999, who was leaving office during an investigation into his own massive corruption. Estimates by 4 different worldwide organizations of the level of endemic corruption in Russia suggested that at a minimum, $30 billion a year was being stolen from the Russian economy. That amounts to 10 to 12% of the national GDP, and that was just what the investigators could prove. Eventually, those losses cost his country dearly. Money that should have gone to train soldiers, to modernize equipment, to keep planes flying and tanks in working order, to simply fill up their gas tanks, all this had been stolen from Russia's military. That higher figure of $1 trillion worth of theft was mentioned again by investigator Bill Browder, who also suggested that Putin's net worth alone is in excess of $200 billion. These funds could have also gone to better roads, better healthcare, and better everything in Russia, not just a better military. But it's the kleptocracy rampant in Russia's military that the invasion of Ukraine has brought front and center. Russia has been undergoing a much-vaunted modernization effort that's been ongoing since 2008, but these efforts have failed to root out Putin's personally embedded sistema, which is present in all levels of Russia's military. The army's infantry commanders frequently inflate the number of active personnel in their units, and from the excess, those commanders steal the surplus funds for themselves. The accounting is continually plagued by falsified numbers of both men and material, which leads to false appraisal of the unit's true combat capability. But the units are not only plagued by missing soldiers and supplies, Their lower-level commanders and sometimes the soldiers themselves have sold available gear and even their own vehicles' gasoline for money or traded them for alcohol. All branches of the armed forces generally have unreliable and opaque reporting up and down the command chain, which has led Russia's leadership to believe its forces were better quantitatively and qualitatively than they really were at the start of the invasion. And with the lack of available gear for their newly mobilized troops, some soldiers or their families have had to resort to buying their own weapons, their own bulletproof gear, and sometimes even their uniforms. That's just sad and weird. And it's about to get weirder. Putin is personally responsible for the three segments that underpin his rule as an autocrat. He perpetuates his rule by maintaining absolute secrecy. He isolates himself from reality by listening to only a very select few advisors. And he surrounded himself with yes-men whose only redeeming quality is their unwavering loyalty. Since the beginning of the invasion in February of 2022, Moscow has, if anything, doubled down on silencing frank discussion of the conflict, even going so far as to criminalize assessments of combat deaths and forecasts about how the war might unfold. Criticism of the war — it's still technically a crime to call Putin's special operation a war, though some media darlings have finally used that term — remains completely off-limits, including discussion of military incompetence and the absence of accountability that has led to the military's serious problems inside of Ukraine. This censorship makes it hard for the military elite to get accurate information on what's going wrong in the war, which in turn hampers their efforts to correct their mistakes. Meanwhile, the level of secrecy that Putin has made an intractable part of the Russian systema was one of the biggest reasons for the early failure of the invasion. The self-defeating deception caused by Putin's decision to prioritize operational secrecy and domestic blindness to the impending war led to a notable lack of adequate planning. Pre-invasion secrecy led to avoidable problems that specifically affected the initial application of Russian air power. Russian pilots had gained some experience fighting air battles in Syria, but operations there had taken place over mostly uncontested desert terrain where enemy opposition could be spotted and dealt with long before it became an actual threat. Russian pilots had almost no experience fighting over a forested country like Ukraine, a much more defensible and far larger area than the rebel-held enclaves in Syria. These pilots also hadn't trained against an opponent with any kind of layered air defenses and numerous man-portable air defense systems or manpads that Ukraine possessed. Russian pilots were given little to no training in such tactics before the invasion. That unpreparedness is partly why Russia has been unable to establish air superiority over the Ukrainian battlefield, and why they've met with such heavy losses in the air. Another factor in the failure of the air assets was how Russia decided to employ their forces. Because their ground troops were in grave danger within days of the invasion, the Russian Air Force had its primary objective switched from suppressing air defenses to providing close air support, which in turn brought them into greater danger from the numerous Western-supplied manpad systems. These missions forced Russian pilots to engage targets at low altitudes, which placed them well within the range of cheap and numerous anti-air missiles, like the US-made Stinger. After the first few months of this, Russia found itself not just suffering unacceptable losses of expensive aircraft and helicopters, but also significant drain of their trained pilots and aircrew, which take months or years' worth of training to replace. And while all this is going on, Putin remains in his creepy little cave of isolation and delusions of grandeur. Not only is Putin's insistence on secrecy a major problem, but he has insulated himself from the reality of the world by relying on just a handful of advisors. By orchestrating the invasion with just a handful of military advisors, many of whom earned their positions not by being good strategists, but by being loyal to a fault, Putin created a plan that had no basis in reality. For example, the primary invasion thrust south from Belarus toward Kyiv brought only enough rations for the troops and fuel for their vehicles to last 2 to 3 days. The level to which Putin and his advisors were out of touch with reality was displayed by the troops who carried with them dress uniforms for their expected victory parade in the middle of the capital. Putin's invasion plan was filled with faulty assumptions, arbitrary political goals, and planning mistakes that ignored key Russian military principles. The initial invasion called for multiple unsupported lines of attack, with no reserve forces, tying the military to far-flung objectives that were unattainable for the modest size of its ground forces. Due to such isolation, Putin erroneously believed that his war plans were sound, that Ukraine would not put up much resistance, and that US and NATO support would not be strong enough or arrive fast enough to make a difference. The invasion plan, reinforced in Putin's mind by his sycophantic comrades, painted a picture of the valiant Russian army riding unchallenged into the territory of Ukraine. The brotherly Ukrainians would welcome them with open arms and would thank them for rescuing all of Ukraine from their neo-Nazi and corrupt drug-addicted leadership. The overmatched Ukrainian forces would run at the first sight of overwhelming Russian forces. After Kyiv fell within 3 days, the liberators would then receive a warm greeting in the southern and eastern regions of the country. The Russian elder brothers would then install a properly subservient government in Kyiv that would gratefully accommodate any demands Putin placed upon them. It came as quite a shock then when Russia's troops, which along with its direct leadership had no inkling that they were going to be an invading army, and ran headlong into a fierce and unified Ukrainian resistance supported by unexpected amounts of advanced Western weaponry and accurate satellite-supported intelligence. The three-pronged invasion suffered far more casualties than they either expected or could cope with. According to Russian doctrine, any major-level war, such as the Ukraine invasion, should have begun with weeks of air and missile attacks targeting an enemy's military installations and critical infrastructure. Russia's planners consider this the decisive period of warfare, with Air Force operations and missile strikes lasting between 4 and 6 weeks, designed to erode the opposing country's military capabilities and capacity to resist. According to Russia's military doctrine, ground forces are typically deployed to secure objectives only after massive artillery bombardments combined with Air Force and missile assaults have weakened or destroyed most of the opposition. But Putin's delusions aren't the only issue in the Ukraine war. When you have a leader who's lost touch with reality and a whole crowd of people cheering "All hail the Emperor's new clothes," your kingdom is pretty much doomed. General George S. Patton used to say, "If everybody is thinking alike, then somebody isn't thinking." Patton was always keenly aware that yes men, those who only tell their bosses what the boss wants to hear, aren't helpful at all, but only reinforce what the boss is already thinking. In 2022, one of Putin's most significant intelligence figures defected to the West, carrying with him a trove of important information about Putin the man, detailing his habits, his fears, and his reluctance to use any cell phones. Gleb Karakulov, who served in the Federal Protection Service, FSO, a quasi-military force tasked with protecting those officials closest to Putin, described Putin as a president who has lost touch with the world. Putin has been living in an information cocoon for the past couple of years, spending most of his time in his residences, which the media very fittingly calls bunkers. He is pathologically afraid for his life. He surrounds himself with an impenetrable barrier of quarantines and an information vacuum. He only values his own life and the lives of his family and friends. Karakulov also shed light on Putin's inner circle. Putin requires all staff working in the same room as him, and anyone who will appear close to him in photo ops, to undergo a 2-week quarantine, which severely limits the number of people who have personal access to him. Karakulov confirmed that Putin relies heavily for information on reports provided by the chiefs of his security services. Putin does not use a cell phone or the internet, and does not even bring an internet specialist with him when he travels abroad. He only receives information from his closest circle, which means that he lives in an information vacuum, Karakulov said. Okay, so we've established Putin is pretty much running his own operation into the ground. But this isn't the only reason Russia is failing in the Russo-Ukraine war. Let's talk about Russia's abysmal logistics for a second. The famous quote, "Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics," has been credited to everyone from Napoleon to US General Omar Bradley. But the first recorded use of that phrase in that form was by a retired 4-star Marine general named Robert Hilliard Barrow. He was speaking about the difference between localized maneuvers that could win a battle and overall army supply coordination that could win or lose a war. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was plagued by logistical nightmares from the very beginning. Ukraine knew they could depend on their home-designed Skiff or Stuna P anti-tank guided missile (ATGM) systems, but they also knew they'd be facing 2,000 or more Russian main battle tanks, plus more than twice that number of armored infantry fighting vehicles (IFVs). Knowing that Ukraine needed help against these armored forces, the US and its allies managed to deliver more than 17,000 anti-tank missile systems to Ukraine within the first month of the war, including the Anglo-Swedish short-range NLAW rocket and the even more powerful US-made Javelin ATGM. Ukraine was also supplied with Bayraktar TB2 drones from Turkey. Ukraine used these weapon systems not just against Russia's armored forces, but also against even more valuable targets, their fuel and ammunition vehicles. Without resupplies of ammunition, Their tanks and even their infantry had to resort to more limited attacks, and without fuel, some of their armored columns ground to a halt completely. Most famous, the 40-mile-long armored column that struck south from Belarus toward Kyiv in the opening days of the war, was stalled due to a combination of stiff Ukrainian resistance, primarily ambushes from either side of the narrow penetration, combined with successful targeting of Russia's ammo and fuel trucks by both anti-tank missiles and targeted drone attacks. Military analysts who have analyzed the early months of the war have come to the conclusion that Russia completely botched its initial invasion for a variety of reasons, and that its campaign has been riddled with miscalculations, poor communication, and widespread confusion. Former CIA military analyst Jeffrey Edmonds, who is also a Russia expert at the Center for Naval Analyses, says in a recent interview, "We would have thought that they would have done a much more deliberate, well-thought-through operation. That is not what they did. Russian warfare usually involved masses of artillery pounding enemy locations, followed by massed armor and mechanized infantry assaults, combined with air support and helicopter attacks. Instead of leading with a substantial air and artillery campaign and gaining strategic superiority over Ukraine, Russian commanders apparently instructed their troops to just drive to Kyiv. The units quickly faced unexpected ambushes, repeated tactical surprise, and a logistics supply train that had not anticipated anything beyond a half-week offensive. The 40-mile traffic jam north of Kyiv underscored another recurring problem with Russian logistics. They are dependent on rail lines to move troops and support gear around their own country, but cannot link those rail lines up with their offensive advances into Ukraine. That leaves a gap between Russia's end-of-the-line ammo and fuel dumps and the Ukrainian front lines. One solution Russian commanders used to reduce that gap, and the length of time it would take to resupply forward units, was placing their supply dumps closer to the front lines. That decision turned disastrous when the US began providing Ukraine with better artillery systems, including the M142 High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, or HIMARS, with its pinpoint accuracy out to 50 miles, twice the range of the M777 howitzer Ukraine had previously been using with its 25-mile range. But Russian commanders failed to respect the accuracy and range of HIMARS systems and continually lost weapon storage depots over and over again. Too often, Russia placed their ammunition in the same building as their troops or close by to such a location. That proved disastrous on at least one occasion, when Ukraine struck an occupied school building in Makiivka in the Donetsk region on New Year's Eve, killing as many as 400 Russian soldiers and wounding another 300, according to Ukraine claims. Another persistent problem in Russia's logistics fiasco has been the reliance on unsecured phone lines. This has allowed Ukrainian intelligence to triangulate their position and strike them with highly accurate artillery and missile strikes. One such attack reportedly left hundreds of Russian soldiers dead and prompted the Russian Ministry of Defense to announce it is already clear that the main reason of what took place included the massive use, contrary to the ban, of personal mobile phones in the range of enemy weapons. Yet such use persists, both from the average trooper to the high command. The Russian news agency TASS suggested that the New Year's Eve attack was also due to soldiers' misuse of civilian cell phones. Preliminarily, the reason for the strike was the active use of mobile phones by the newly arrived military personnel. The enemy revealed the activity of cellular communications and the location of the subscribers, which allowed them to target the temporary barracks. And then there's Russia's mass misjudgment of NATO's united front. Putin and his tiny handful of advisors also miscalculated the stiffness of NATO's resolve to defend Ukraine, as well as their willingness to arm them with every weapon system they could. Putin believed the individual countries of NATO, led by the US, Germany, France, Great Britain, and Poland, would each go their separate ways and would fail to provide a united front against what Putin expected would be a short blitzkrieg-type war. Instead, his brutal invasion solidified NATO's unity and even helped convince new countries like Finland and Sweden to ask for membership. Finland's admission, making NATO's 31st member, was an especially bitter pill to swallow, as it increased NATO's border presence with Russia by an extra 830 miles. This was clearly one of Putin's most significant blunders. The US, NATO, and the European Union have remained relatively united in providing billions of military aid to Ukraine, as well as considerable humanitarian assistance, while simultaneously applying sweeping sanctions against Russia. The sanctions have crippled the Russian economy, which took an extra hit from the loss of between 700,000 and 1 million young Russians who fled the country ahead of Putin's draft in the fall of 2022. The Russian population pyramid, already in an upside-down position with a declining birth rate and far more older citizens than young ones to replace them, is now teetering like a half-chopped-down tree, ready to collapse at any moment. Now let's get into the truly ridiculous part of our analysis of Putin's failures as a war commander: fighting a modern war using World War I tactics. By the end of the first year of the war, it became clear that in addition to all the strategic and leadership mistakes Putin and Russia have committed, there's a vast difference in how the two armies are fighting it out on the ground. While Ukraine has relied heavily on smart weapons, surveillance and attack drones, ATGMs, manpads, precision-guided munitions, even drone attack boats in the Black Sea, Russia has settled on the World War I tactic of massed artillery, followed by human waves of soldiers, often without even the benefit of a few tanks sprinkled in here and there for support. Such tactics may have worked in World War I, or even the latter stages of World War II, when the former Soviet Union had more than 1 million men under arms, and was facing a severely weakened German army that had bled white from 4 years of continuous warfare. But Ukraine has learned to adapt and overcome, and has used its precision artillery systems, especially the HIMARS artillery, to telling effect. Meanwhile, Russia has used their huge surplus of artillery to flatten cities like Bakhmut, Mariinka, and Mariupol. But the massed infantry assaults that followed leveled a horrific toll on the attackers. Estimates are that in addition to losing more than half of their pre-war stockpile of main battle tanks, Russia has lost more than 200,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Their losses in the 10-month effort to take Bakhmut have been so enormous that the Wagner private mercenary group that spearheaded the 10-month battle had to pull out of the line of combat to refit, retrain, and regroup. Some estimates say that Wagner may have lost 90% of their 80,000-man full strength. Wagner's leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, will only admit to having lost 20,000 men, which is still a staggeringly high number of casualties for a city that has no inherent strategic value. While we're on the subject of losses, let's talk about the real crime and tragedy of this war. Because of the sanctions limiting Russia's access to computer chips and other resources for their high-tech industries, Russia's been unable to replace many of their advanced weapons, such as their precision munitions and state-of-the-art missiles. That's why analysts are stunned to see Putin wasting so much of its stockpiles of precision munitions on striking civilian targets. Military experts and government officials have said that Putin's terror campaign against the Ukrainian population was not a sustainable use of Russia's limited stockpiles and was unlikely to negatively affect Ukraine's will to fight. In fact, just the opposite has happened. Continued explosions in civilian areas across Ukraine, not just the capital of Kyiv, have hardened the average Ukrainian's resolve to see this fight through until every Russian soldier has been pushed out of their country. More recently, senior U.S. intelligence officials have said Russia is burning through its munitions faster than it can replace them. Officials also say the use of massive amounts of artillery and precision-guided munitions has forced Moscow to turn to Iran and North Korea for supplies. Retired U.S. Army General David Petraeus summed up just a few of the mistakes Putin has made during his invasion of Ukraine when he said, "They completely underestimated the Ukrainian forces and completely overestimated the Russian forces, and they could not impose their line of conducting a military campaign and prepare forces for conducting this campaign. In addition, they did not have modern telecommunication systems," he said, referring to their use of civilian cell phones. Therefore, the generals continued to die, commanding an army from within an intelligence vacuum, relying on sycophants and toadies rather than experts and veterans. An army sent to war without proper planning, hamstrung by poor logistics, and saddled with rampant thievery, underestimating your opponent's will to fight, misjudging NATO's united front, squandering sophisticated precision weapons on a campaign to try to break the will of a large civilian population, youth movement to leave the country, possibly for good, an economy that has been wrecked by sanctions that continue to penalize the ones who are still left day after day. It seems like Putin not only did not follow Sun Tzu's dictum to win your battles by making no mistakes, it seems like he's made practically every mistake in the book. But what do you think? What is Putin's greatest mistake in the war in Ukraine? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.
Poor training is killing Russian pilots, and it's not looking good for Putin's ambitions in Ukraine. Despite having over 700 aircraft, including as many as 400 modern multi-role fighter jets and fighter bomber planes to its name, the Russian Aerospace Forces, or VKS, has experienced dramatic losses over the Ukrainian skies. Estimates vary, though some suggest that the VKS has lost around 130 planes and the pilots flying them since the beginning of the war. Why have these losses been so severe? Though equipment issues have certainly played a role, the far bigger issue for Russia right now is the apparent lack of training many of its pilots received prior to taking to the skies during the conflict. And that inferior training, which is already leading to many more than Russia anticipated, not only suggests we'll see more of the country's pilots lose their lives in the current conflict, but may lead to the complete breakdown of the VKS as a powerful force in the future. This is not what Putin expected. When the conflict between Russia and Ukraine began, many assumed that Russia would have the advantage on almost all fronts. A historically great, if somewhat slow-moving, military nation, the country was believed to have a stockpile of weaponry that would allow it to overwhelm Ukrainian forces that would likely have to rely on guerrilla tactics while fighting on home soil, and as mentioned, the country has a huge stockpile of aircraft ready to fly. Along with the 400 modern fighters discussed earlier, it was believed the VKS has over 300 legacy planes that have been converted to handle modern combat capabilities, MiG-31BM and MiG-29 SMTs among them, to create an impressive air force that would wreak havoc on Ukrainian defenses. In fact, the prevailing opinion was that Russia's VKS was so well trained that its pilots could effectively use this blend between modern and repurposed planes as part of Komeos, composite air operations that could involve up to 100 aircraft. Many believe, despite some of the country's aircraft starting to show their age, the modern fighter jets it has, which include the Su-34 and Su-35, would make up for any airborne deficiencies that could occur. That hasn't happened. And looking at Russia's recent history in wartime situations, the reasons why become clearer. Take its 2015 intervention in the Syrian civil war as an example. Rather than using composite air operations or Komeos, most of Russia's sorties in this conflict focused on sending single aircraft or paired fighters to either patrol the skies or drop weapons, unguided, to ground troops. Though perhaps escaping attention at the time, this lack of Komeo use hinted at a larger problem in the VKS that we've only seen come to fruition about half a decade later. The VKS may not have flown Komeos because their pilots were simply incapable of the job. The question is simple: why? Why did the VKS actively avoid employing Komeo tactics in Syria, despite Komeos being much more effective than single and paired pilot runs? And why hasn't the VKS improved its approach during the Ukrainian conflict? It appears the answer may come down to a combination of a variety of factors. Let's start with inferior equipment. There's an old saying that a good worker never blames their tools for failing to get the job done. However, that saying doesn't apply in the world of air combat, where even the slightest issue with equipment can make the difference between life and death. In Russia's case, the tools they're providing to their pilots don't appear to be fit for purpose when it comes to succeeding in an extended conflict, such as the one the war in Ukraine has become. Take the supposedly modernized MiG fighters that make up a large proportion of the country's air fleet as an example. According to the RAND Corporation, these Soviet-era aircraft, which have been in operation since the 1980s, were built to handle up to 3,500 hours of flight. And though many of the craft have been upgraded to extend this maximum output, the fact remains that much of Moscow's fleet, particularly its MiGs and the earlier Su models, are reaching the end of their service lives. In fact, RAND estimates that Russia may have lost up to 57 of its aircraft due to the extra hours asked of them beyond their capabilities, with some being shot down due to a combination of reasons: pilot inadequacy and the craft itself no longer being viable in combat. Now let's switch our attention to the more modern fighters in the Russian fleet. The Su-35 is the jewel in the Moscow crown, but when it's stacked up against other modern fighters, particularly the American F-22 Raptor stealth jet, it gets left in the dust every time. Take the Su-35's radar cross-section, for instance. Business Insider reported back in 2016 that the Su-35's radar cross-section landed somewhere between 3 and 10 feet, easily detectable by most advanced radar hardware. By comparison, the F-22s came back at the size of a marble. Having a more detectable plane creates a challenge for even the most skilled of pilots, but for the poorly trained flyers in the VKS, it's practically a death sentence. There are other issues. For instance, the Su-35 is also one of the few modern fighter jets not to have an active electronically scanned array (AESA) radar, instead using the older passive electronically scanned array (PACER) radars. Those PACER radars are more prone to jamming and malfunctions and aren't as capable as AESA's of detecting smaller targets, especially those on the ground. And so, we see the modern Russian pilot's first problem. They're flying and being trained on outdated military hardware that isn't fit for purpose when stacked against modern options. But this brings us to an interesting point. Ukraine hardly has the most advanced fleet either, with much of its meager air force using similar updated Soviet-era machines as the Russians, and yet far more Russian pilots are getting shot down or crashing compared to Ukrainian pilots. There must be more going on behind the scenes, and if you look a little closer, it becomes a lot easier to see the evidence of poor training that may be at the heart of Russia's recent flight failures. In 2022, Harry Bonham, an aerospace analyst at the analytics company Global Data, offered some insight into what the VKS's pilot training methodology looks like. He said that training outlines provided by the VKS indicated that a graduating pilot from the Russian Air Force's academy had to complete over 100 hours of flight time as recently as 2017, with that number only increasing to over 120 hours in recent years. By comparison, he points out that the average Western pilot will notch between 180 and 240 flight hours under their belt before they head out into the field, up to double the flight time amassed by a supposedly qualified Russian equivalent. Perhaps we see a link between Russian training methods and the deteriorating state of its air fleet here. Remember that Rand points out a large portion of the VKS's fleet is outdated to the point where some of its planes are hitting the end of their lives as the conflict goes on, reducing Russian air strength in the process. Could the lack of training hours Russian pilots undergo, at least in comparison to their Western equivalents, be blamed on the VKS essentially rationing out the flight hours the older equipment in its fleet still has available? That's speculative, but it would at least partially explain why Russian pilots are handicapped by having fewer flight hours than pilots from other nations. But what's more important is the effect that this lack of flight hours has on pilots during active operations. Bonham points out that Russian authorities are likely aware of the issues this inexperience causes, which has undermined their confidence in their ability to pull off joint operations, particularly with the SAM units their troops have on the ground. We also see a lack of confidence in Russia's failure to leverage Komeo tactics, as discussed earlier, and that, combined with logistical issues, appears to hamper Russia's ability to not only secure Ukrainian airspace, but to do so without suffering casualties. Inexperience may also come into play when it comes to Russia's scarce use of precision-guided munitions, PGMs. It's known that the VKS has access to PGMs, which can be guided to their targets using a combination of lasers and the Russian equivalent of GPS, GLONASS, and yet we've seen fairly few of these types of munitions utilized in the Ukraine conflict. We can speculate in several directions when it comes to why, with one of the more popular opinions being that Russia has failed to stockpile enough PGMs for an extended conflict, hence their need to ration the munitions. But what seems equally likely is that many of the country's pilots simply don't know how to deploy PGMs effectively. Again, the lack of training hours comes into play here, taking away a form of attack that would aid in pilot safety. How? Rather than using PGMs, the VKS has generally used dumb bombs to attack Ukrainian targets. These unguided munitions can only hit targets once the pilot achieves visual confirmation of the target's existence, which forces the pilot to fly low and steady, making them a sitting duck for anti-air attacks. And that mention of flying low brings us to another issue with Russian pilot training. Many of its pilots seem to struggle to fly low safely. An April 2023 report by the Royal United Services Institute, a think tank based in the UK, highlighted that Russia's pilots either seem to be unwilling or incapable of providing close air support to troops on the ground. Providing that support would require pilots to know how to fly safely at low altitudes, which the report says is something that many, if not most, Russian pilots simply haven't been trained to do. The report goes on to state that flying at low altitudes, especially in contested situations, isn't part of the core training that Russian pilots go through in order to earn their wings. The only ones that can are typically members of the Su-25SM Frogfoot fleet, a small part of the VKS's fleet. That lack of low-altitude training bore its most terrible fruits, at least from a Russian perspective, during the first week of March 2022. The country lost 10 of its jets, alongside several helicopters in that week, all shot down by Ukrainian forces, and most flying below 3,000 feet in daylight conditions. Those crafts became instantly vulnerable to Ukrainian manpads, shoulder-fired missiles deployed by ground-based troops, and it's not speculative to say that the VKS quickly decided that having its pilots flying low to the ground, especially in daylight hours, simply wasn't an option anymore. After that first week of March 2022, the VKS quickly switched from using fixed-wing and rotary craft on the front lines to bombarding Ukrainian troops with unguided rockets and minimal PGM attacks. Speaking of Russian aircraft shot down during the early stages of the war, another issue was discovered that perfectly demonstrates how the combination of poor training and inadequate equipment leads to the deaths of so many VKS pilots. In a speech at the National Army Museum in May 2022, the then Defense Secretary of the United Kingdom, Ben Wallace, noted that several downed VKS jets had been found with insecure navigational equipment. As Wallace, a graduate of Sandhurst's Royal Military Academy, put it, the equipment essentially seemed to be GPS receivers that were taped to the dashboards of the jets. These findings raise more questions. Does the VKS have so little faith in the Russian GLONASS system that it's willing to place its pilots at risk by supplying them with insecure and unencrypted GPS receivers that make them easier to detect? Or has the lack of training these pilots have received led them to independently trying to use these GPS systems because they're unaware of the risks that come with navigating using unsecured equipment? Either possibility is disturbing, but both could have played a hand in why Russia lost so many of its pilots during the early stages of the Ukraine conflict. Even so, Russia is a large country with a population of nearly 145 million people. Even with the loss of so many pilots due to poor training and inadequate equipment, surely it can train more to replace those losses, and even with so many of its jets being shot down, it still easily has the aerial might to subdue Ukraine, right? Unfortunately for Russia, it's not that simple. A May 2022 story published in the Moscow Times reported that Major General Kanamat Batashev was shot down from the skies over Ukraine while piloting a Su-25 fighter jet. While that story may seem unremarkable in the context of the dramatic losses Russia has already experienced, it becomes more interesting when you learn that Batashev was a 63-year-old retired pilot. What's more, he'd essentially been forced into retirement from active duty in 2012 after he'd crashed a Su-27 while demonstrating acrobatic maneuvers, which raises an obvious question. What was a retired and high-ranking member of the Russian military doing flying on the front lines of the conflict? The answer likely comes back to the lack of training the country's other pilots have. Perhaps the VKS wasn't confident in the skills of its younger flyers, forcing them into bringing older pilots who are perhaps not up to speed on modern flying into the fold. Batashev's death shows that it may not have been a good tactic. Still, it also presents another problem for Russia, as his death, along with the deaths of other senior members, could have a knock-on effect on the quality of future pilots in the VKS. In fact, this is something that Yuri Inat, the spokesman for the Ukrainian Air Force, all but said in comments published in Ukrainska Pravda, an online Ukrainian news website. He points out that the VKS is continuing to train pilots in its academy and likely has the ability to create between 100 and 150 new pilots annually. So there's little danger of the VKS running out of flyers. But Inat points out that the quality of those pilots will be lower in comparison to those who've already been shot down, as many of the pilots so far were veterans of the Syrian conflict mentioned earlier. So the future clearly presents a problem for the VKS on two fronts. First, it appears to rely on sheer numbers to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses. This has already been demonstrated not to work, and will only become a less viable tactic as more inexperienced pilots enter the conflict. Second, losing so many of its veterans to the war means that the pilots the VKS train in the future will lose valuable sources of knowledge, both in the academy and when they're in the field, compounding their inexperience to the point where it becomes dangerous. And worse yet for Putin, it's not just Ukrainians shooting down his most experienced flyers that he has to worry about, it's his own people. In June 2023, Putin confirmed that the Wagner militia mutineers managed to down 13 VKS pilots during their short-lived insurrection. That's 13 on top of the 130 or so that Ukraine has managed to shoot down. And it's likely that at least some of those pilots were experienced veterans. The picture painted here is grim. If the VKS's pilots can't even handle a militia mutiny, one that lasted only a day, what chance do they have when trying to take on Ukrainian troops on less familiar soil? Ironically, fighting from within has done as much to expose the poor training of the VKS pilots as the war in Ukraine has. Through all of this, it's important not to discount the fact that Ukraine has done an excellent job of exploiting the weaknesses inherent in the VKS approach. For instance, Forbes reports that the VKS training doctrine essentially classes its air force as an extension of its army. That approach, which again is mirrored in the training that the VKS pilots receive, leads to Russia approaching air combat as a way to briefly control small portions of airspace, so its craft can come in, drop bombs, and leave. That runs counter to the Kameyo approach taken by the US Air Force, which focuses on coordinated efforts to control large amounts of airspace and, as we've already seen, plays right into Ukraine's hands. VKS pilots are trained to come in and deploy munitions, but at the same time, that tactic requires an understanding of low-altitude flight, which we've already established is an understanding many VKS pilots don't have. Ukraine has taken advantage of this lack of training in the very approach that Russia favors to down dozens of fixed-wing fighters using manpads backed by long-range defense systems, such as Tunguska and Tor. It's smart work by the Ukrainians. Knowing how Russia was likely to use its air fleet to attack, it essentially forced dozens of inexperienced pilots flying at low altitudes directly into a path of its anti-air defenses, and due, at least in part, to their lack of training, many of these pilots did not know how to avoid ground-based defenses that are hardly innovative in the theater of war. When you combine this knowledge of VKS tactics with the consistent stream of information and equipment Ukraine is receiving from its Western allies, the situation continues to look dire for a Russian air force that is already depleted and likely only to be restocked with more poorly trained pilots. Finally, consider this. In August 2023, the United States approved the delivery of F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. While far from the newest jets the US has to offer, F-16s have poorer radar and less capable missiles than Russia's Su-35, it's entirely possible that better training delivered to Ukraine's pilots could lead them to understanding their crafts better than Russian pilots understand the ones they're flying. So it may not be long before we see reports of Ukrainian pilots actively downing Russian ones in dogfights, assuming Russia is brave enough to send its pilots to fight Ukraine's directly, given the losses the VKS has experienced so far. But what do you think? How large a role has the poor training offered to Russia's pilots played in the losses the VKS has suffered during the conflict? Is Russia even capable of creating a new crop of pilots that won't fall victim to the combination of outdated equipment, ineffective training, and superior Ukrainian tactics in the future? Tell us your opinions in the comment section below. Here's something you've probably heard a lot of in the last few months. Russia is running out of tanks. But while this refrain was once something of a joke, now, more than half a year into the invasion of Ukraine, it looks like a new reality, and you won't believe how bad it's gotten. As of August 2023, the numbers are truly staggering. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Russia has lost an estimated 4,330 tanks and 8,400 armored combat vehicles, not to mention over 250,000 soldiers. While these numbers are likely inflated to some degree, anything even close to these figures represents most of the country's pre-war supply of armor and will have long-lasting implications for both Russia and the international community. Similarly, a recent open-source investigation by Norwegian researcher Ragnar Gudmundsson shows that Russia is definitely relying on more and more older tanks. He found that in the first days of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, 71% of the lost tanks accounted for vehicles modernized or produced in the Russian Federation, and just 29% were Soviet-era models. However, as of June 2023, it was a very different situation. 73% of lost Russian tanks originated from the Soviet Union, while only 27% were newer types. This strongly suggests that Russian tank supplies have reached a tipping point, where they can no longer be replaced. It could also change the dynamics of this grinding conflict, potentially signaling that the Russian war effort is finally running out of steam. So let's dive into how this happened and just what it means for the future of the war in Ukraine. Alright, let's circle back to Putin's ongoing battle to hang on to his tanks. And honestly, by now, there's no surprises here. This guy's lack of skill is starting to feel like an endless saga. Reports over the summer have confirmed that Russian tank losses are so heavy that the country has moved many of its ancient Soviet tanks out of storage. This includes the T-54 and T-55, which are more than 75 years old, and essentially obsolete in today's combat environments. Back when it made its battlefield debut, the T-55 was a highly effective tank, but it entered service just after the Second World War, soon becoming one of the most highly produced tanks ever, with an estimated 100,000 built over the next few decades. As a result, the T-55 played a role in just about every single conflict during the Cold War period, and frightened Western countries so much that they rushed to mass-produce their own battle tanks. It was also built to survive just about anything, with a massive 205mm of frontal turret armor and 120mm of slanted hull armor. This armor is so tough that the tank itself survived tests with a 15-kiloton nuclear explosion at only 300 meters away. The T-55 also has a 100mm gun, which was once a threat to anything in the NATO arsenal. But that was the 1950s. Today's modern tank systems make the T-55 look like junk, and there is little question which would prevail in a head-to-head battle. That's not to mention that T-55s also included a so-called jack-in-the-box flaw, which has doomed many of Russia's other Soviet-era tanks. Unlike modern battle tanks such as the German Leopard 2 or US M1 Abrams, which keep their shells away from the crew behind thick armored walls, older Soviet tanks store their ammunition in a carousel-style automatic loader sitting directly below the main turret and crew. A well-placed shot to their thin roof armor can ignite the ammunition and easily blow up the tank. As Professor Robert E. Hamilton of the US Army War College put it bluntly, for a Russian crew, if the ammo storage compartment is hit, everyone is dead. He adds that the force of the explosion will instantaneously vaporize anyone unlucky enough to be inside. So why has Russia been forced to rely on these death trap antiques? And what in the world happened to all its decent tanks? The short answer is that Ukraine happened. The long answer is that years of poor combat doctrine and failure to learn from past mistakes have made Ukraine's stunning success much easier than anyone predicted. Russia's initial offensive into the country last year was nothing short of a disaster, with endless strategic and tactical blunders, and ineffective approaches to modern urban and semi-urban combat. This was reflected strongly in the performance of its tank units. Battle tanks are one of the most effective and critical weapons in modern warfare. While jets and bombers are more destructive, they cannot be used to hold and control territory in the same way that a tank can. The main gun of a tank can pin down enemies and even level buildings. Some tanks have specialized rounds intended to do just that. Composite tank armor is also incredibly tough, using layers and structural reinforcement to stop anything short of another tank blast or very well-placed missile. And anything a tank is able to blow apart, it can also roll over, making most low cover ineffective. But for all their power, tanks can easily be stopped without proper support. Russia has continually failed to learn this lesson, which helps account for the abysmal performance of its tanks in Ukraine. And by taking advantage of this reality, Ukrainian defenders were able to pull off some of their most astonishing victories of the war. But while this has become obvious to most observers since February 2022, Russia's failure to properly utilize its tanks actually has quite an embarrassing history. For instance, during the First Chechen War of 1994 to 1996, Russia mobilized its enormous arsenal of Soviet tanks to try and crush the smaller and less equipped Chechen forces. But as Russian troops discovered all the way back then, superior numbers and equipment don't mean very much when executed badly. Lacking their own tanks, Chechen rebels instead relied on anti-tank missiles, RPGs, tank mines, and even improvised explosive devices. Much as Ukraine has, they also use this limited toolkit to take advantage of major weaknesses in Russian warfighting doctrine. This doctrine relies on tanks leading the way of every ground assault, with infantry fighting vehicles behind providing close support. But the usefulness of infantry support is greatly diminished when troops are stuck inside vehicles, leaving them unable to detect ambushes or respond quickly. In Chechnya, rebels took advantage of this by fighting in urban environments and using guerrilla tactics to fire from many positions at once. Firing from above also allows them to target the thin armor on the tank's roofs, often resulting in devastating ambushes. Russia's enormous casualties from a tank-heavy warfighting doctrine with no effective infantry support would be repeated during the Second Chechen War only years later. Russia was able to secure eventual victory in both these conflicts by using brutal artillery strikes and the huge size of its armed forces to seize and hold the capital Grozny. But the wars showed some fundamental weaknesses which many people failed to pay attention to. As Olga Oliker, an analyst from the RAND Corporation, wrote way back in 2001 that failure to prepare for urban combat was a key error the Russians made in both Chechnya wars, but it was far from the only one. Hampered by poor training and supplies, decrepit equipment, and abysmal planning, the 1994–96 war presented a stark picture of how much this once great force had deteriorated. It also demonstrated how poorly the Russian military organizational structures functioned when disparate forces were called upon to work together. Sound familiar? It should, because today not a single one of these underlying issues had been addressed. Throughout the early 21st century, Russian combat doctrine continually relied on heavy tanks without adequate infantry support, counting on the use of superior numbers and firepower to overwhelm smaller enemies. Issues with training, supplies, equipment, and planning were never addressed, while Putin's kleptocratic dictatorship funneled huge chunks of the military budget into oligarchs' bank accounts. Fast forward to 2022, and it's pretty easy to see how the invasion of Ukraine was a disaster waiting to happen. Ukraine is far bigger than Chechnya, while its military is just as fiercely determined and tactically flexible as the rebels were. Ukrainian war planners also took advantage of the same weaknesses, drawing Russian forces into built-up urban areas where their tanks were highly vulnerable and unleashing extremely effective ambushes. This was obvious during the first weeks of the invasion, where Russian tank columns rolling into Kyiv were stopped in their tracks by Ukrainian ambushes. As armor and troops poured into the country, General Colonel Oleksandr Syrsky, the head of Ukraine's ground forces, determined that the Russian columns would need to advance along 2 or 3 major highways to enter Kyiv in their blitzkrieg attack. So Syrsky organized 2 rings of troops to defend the city, one in the outer suburbs and one in the capital, with as much space between them as possible, in order to minimize damage to infrastructure. He also moved Ukrainian artillery and mobile anti-tank units into concealed defensive positions to the north and northwest of Kyiv, allowing them to easily target the highways and saving them from Russian airstrikes. He also moved Ukrainian artillery and mobile anti-tank units into concealed defensive positions to the north and northwest of Kyiv. This strategy proved to be extremely effective, allowing defenders to destroy many of the slow-moving tanks. Videos like this now famous 45-second clip released by Ukraine's defense ministry showed entire companies of Russian armor being destroyed in deadly ambushes by Ukrainian hit-and-run teams, using anti-tank guided missiles or ATGMs. As Russian columns rolled through built-up urban areas in long, strung out with no infantry support, they were devastated by such barrages. This was even clearer later on. For instance, during the battle for the small town of Vuhledar. In early 2023, Ukraine placed hundreds of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines in the fields outside the town. Due to the flat landscape and lack of cover, any Russian minesweepers were immediately targeted with artillery fire. Ukrainian troops left corridors between the mined fields, only large enough for 2 or 3 Russian tanks at a time to roll through. If the tanks moved at all from the cleared path, they risked having their treads blown off, leaving them totally exposed to artillery strikes. When Russian commanders predictably ordered their tanks to lead the assault along these unmined paths outside Vuhledar, it left them incredibly vulnerable to the same type of ambushes Ukrainians have deployed since the start of the invasion. Hiding in covered positions near the tank columns, Ukrainian hunter-killer teams set up anti-tank missiles on both sides of the kill zone. Without triggering the anti-tank mines, these teams were able to cross the minefields and dig themselves into strategic positions, often hiding in bushes or abandoned buildings. From there they could fire and retreat with little fear of being hit by tank fire. Much like Chechen rebels, Ukrainians also used building rooftops and windows to target the weakly armored top sections of tanks. Because Russia refused to dismount their infantry to avoid them getting shot, this left them completely unable to fight back. But unlike Chechen rebels, Ukrainian troops have also had the advantage of modern ATGMs, which they have used to incredible effect against Russian armor. These include everything from the more basic Ukrainian-manufactured Stugna P to advanced Western-produced systems like the Javelin, Next-Generation Light Anti-Tank Weapon or NLAW, and AT-4. These 4 ATGMs have accounted for the majority of Russia's tank losses during the invasion, providing Ukrainians with a highly cost-effective way of handling tank columns. As a result, in just one 3-week period, Russia lost over 130 tanks and armored vehicles in Vuhledar, forcing Putin to rely on human wave-style infantry assaults to try and take the position. And in other battles during the war, Russia did actually dismount its infantry troops, but poor training and equipment meant that they failed to properly scan the flanks. When the ambushes began, many Russian soldiers also panicked, leading to a breakdown in the chain of command and chaotic, disorganized retreats. Infantry fled and tried to find cover wherever possible. In some places, Russian soldiers were even rolled over by their own armor. Footage from a later battle at Vuhledar, shared on Telegram earlier this year, showed 2 Russian soldiers being dragged under a retreating tank, and a soldier covered in flames running from a tank shortly before it exploded. Complete disasters like this are only possible with badly trained troops, as one of the earliest lessons taught in any effective infantry academy is how to react to ambushes by rallying and pushing out of the kill zone. Because Russian infantry have failed to do so, it often hasn't even mattered that they have dismounted to support the tank units. Multiply this by a year and a half of fighting, and it's easy to see why Russia is pulling antiques like the T-55 out of storage and museums. Recent satellite imagery shows that an open-air depot in remote Buryatia in eastern Siberia has lost about 40% of all tanks and armored vehicles it had previously been housing. This is Russia's largest known tank depot, suggesting that others may be even more depleted. And with every passing month, the Russian military fields increasingly less capable tanks as they cannot replace their losses. International sanctions mean they cannot obtain the advanced parts necessary to build more modern armor, such as the T-90 or T-14 Armata. It's also unclear how many tanks Russia was able to produce even before the invasion. Some Russian sources say that one of its largest tank production plants was capable of pumping out 20 a month, with others claiming slightly less. The country also has 2 new plants under construction, but even so, its production cannot compare to the staggering losses of more than 150 a month in Ukraine. And anything actually coming off the line in Russia is now certainly not modern. Sanctions mean no modern electronics for targeting or specialized kits like thermal vision. They even affect things as basic as ball bearings, which are crucial to the production of modern vehicles. Before the war, Russia received some 55% of ball bearings from Europe, Canada, and the US. These deficiencies make producing anything more advanced than a T-80 essentially impossible, seriously diminishing the future potential of Russian armor as a whole. Unable to obtain modern parts, Russia has resorted to pushing tanks off the line with only gunners' sights, reducing the range of their guns by almost 1.5 miles. That type of distance seriously matters against something like a Leopard 2 or M1 Abrams. Russian tanks will essentially have to engage in close-quarters combat, hoping that they can gain the element of surprise against superior Ukrainian firepower. Needless to say, this will result in even greater losses of armor and soldiers, creating a vicious cycle of decreased production and increased costs. Very few governments could sustain wartime production in such an environment, and Putin's government, as the last few years have shown us, is anything but effective or competent. This is especially true due to the economic strain and enormous costs imposed by the destruction of tanks and other materiel. During the first months of 2023, Russia blew through its entire defense budget for the year, and there are no indications that new sources of revenue are opening up. European price caps on Russian oil, import bans, and corruption and inefficiency in Russia's massive oil sector mean that this year it will be lucky to break even. This is a disaster for the country's wider economy, since the Russian oil and natural gas sector has historically been its most economically powerful, accounting for 20% of its pre-war GDP and 45% of its monthly budget. Adding to the economic pain is the fact that Russia is now taxing its domestic oil industry based on Brent crude prices, rather than its own energy prices, meaning energy companies in Russia are paying taxes on revenue that cannot even be generated. In the best case, this scenario will leave the country's oil market breaking even, meaning its funds cannot be used to subsidize the production of new tanks or any other military hardware. Long story short, there really is no effective path for Russia to keep its production of tanks going long-term, all while its embarrassingly bad combat doctrine and lack of modern technology ensures that steep losses on the battlefield will continue. While Ukraine has far less capability to produce its own tanks, that won't matter nearly as much if it continues to receive aid from the West. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg recently confirmed that more than 98% of the combat vehicles promised to Ukraine have already been delivered, and that means over 1,550 armored vehicles, 230 tanks and other equipment, including vast amounts of ammunition. In total, we have trained and equipped more than 9 new Ukrainian armored brigades. This will put Ukraine in a strong position to continue to retake occupied territory. Whether these are followed up by more tanks and armored infantry vehicles later this year or in 2024 likely depends on Ukraine's performance in its slowly ramping up counteroffensive, as well as continued international political support for Ukraine. There is little question that even the current supply of tanks will pose a massive challenge to Russia's ability to hold on to its occupied territory. But it is also a matter of more than just firepower. The UK Ministry of Defence recently wrote that Russia has constructed some of the most extensive systems of military defensive networks seen anywhere in the world for many decades, not just near the current front lines, but also deep inside areas Russia currently controls. Intelligence reports and satellite imagery show a particular effort to fortify the northern border of Crimea with a multi-layered defensive zone built up around the village of Medvedevka, including minefields designed to force Ukraine into a choke point. All of this indicates that Russian field commanders are at least now aware that their own losses are a serious issue, and that Ukraine's modern tanks will likely win in any head-to-head engagement. Because of this, the coming months of the war may become a standoff, with Ukraine unable to penetrate Russia's defensive positions, but Russia unable to launch another tank offensive for fear of losing its now limited supplies. In the end, as with many wars, the future of this conflict will most likely be determined by attrition. Whichever side can outlast the other will be able to gain the upper hand, especially in the critical area of tank warfare. Russia's experience so far shows that it never dealt with the long-standing issues present in its military and economy, something which has only been accelerated after a year and a half of war and sanctions. Its enormous tank losses certainly seem unsustainable, but only time will tell if they ultimately tip the balance of power in favor of Ukraine. But what do you think? Will Russian tank losses prove to be a deciding factor in the conflict, or will Russia be able to overcome its issues and keep Ukraine's counteroffensive from achieving success? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. At this point, we're pretty sure that Putin is sticking his head into a paper bag in panic and trying not to hyperventilate on a daily basis. While he has several reasons for doing this, losing thousands of tanks on the battlefield in Ukraine, the ongoing NATO expansion, coup attempts, and more, there's another looming threat that he can't seem to escape. Ukraine is equipped with US weapons, and Russia can't seem to stop them. But why? Is Putin really that incompetent? What are these weapons, and how come Putin can't fight them off? Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine began more than a year ago, the United States has committed more than $45 billion worth of aid to help the country defend its sovereignty. Much of this has taken the form of high-tech, lethal military equipment. The assistance has proven to be critical for Ukraine's battlefield success, and a nightmare for Putin and his top military planners. Now, 19 months into the conflict, it could make all the difference in Ukraine's slowly growing counteroffensive. So let's take a look at what equipment the US has sent so far. What else might it be planning to send, and why Russian troops seem to be so helpless against US-exported firepower? Among the most important weapons the US has sent so far to Ukraine is the FGM-148 Javelin, a potent anti-tank guided missile system, or ATGM. Jointly manufactured by defense giants Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, the Javelin first entered service in 1996 as a replacement for the older M47 Dragon missile. It has also proven to be one of the most effective pieces of US military aid. Ukraine has received more than 7,000 Javelins since the start of the invasion, and has put them to remarkable use. Each Javelin system consists of two parts: the launch tube assembly and the reusable command launch unit, or CLU. The CLU works as the brains of the Javelin, and features 4 times magnification as well as night vision and thermal sights. This allows for independent target verification, meaning small, independent squads can use Javelins effectively. Before firing, a 12 times magnification setting allows users to zoom in on a target for identification. To fire, the gunner switches to a Seeker FOV mode with 9 times magnification, which is fed into the missile's guidance unit to lock onto a target. One of the Javelin's biggest strengths is its trajectory. It features 2 modes, direct fire and top attack. In top attack mode, its missiles travel in a high arc, in order to strike the less armored section of a tank at the top of its turret. Its automatic infrared guidance and fire and forget design also allows the user to seek cover immediately after launch and avoid retaliatory strikes. Javelins can also penetrate even the toughest tank armor, as they are fitted with powerful 19-pound tandem warheads. A primary charge penetrates the thick composite armor, while a secondary charge follows and detonates inside the tank. However, these features also make Javelins expensive, at about $200,000 per unit and $78,000 per replacement missile. Money aside, Javelins have become a staple of Ukraine's defense throughout the war so far. even being turned into an inspirational internet meme termed Saint Javelin by Ukrainian-Canadian journalist Christian Boris. Even as the invasion shifted into its current brutal back and forth of artillery barrages trench warfare, the Javelin has continued to prove invaluable to Ukrainian forces. Countless videos like this one shared by Yahoo News have shown unsuspecting Russian troops and tank columns rolling into ambushes by javelin-wielding Ukrainians. As the javelins are fired, tanks and other armored vehicles can be seen exploding and catching fire. One tank was able to fire before it was struck and immobilized, billowing smoke. At one point in the video, 3 desperate Russian soldiers can be seen jumping out of a burning vehicle and running away from it. Scenes like this show why the Javelin is among the most effective tools the US has given Ukraine to beat back Russia. But their usefulness has a lot to do with the issues in Russian combat doctrine. Russian tank tactics, which have not evolved much since the 1990s, involve operating tank columns on their own, without the aid of close infantry support. Usually in modern combined arms warfare, infantry units support tanks by keeping hunter-killer teams away, while putting down covering fire and stopping columns from rolling into ambushes. But because Russia operates its armor independently, Ukrainian troops have been able to use javelins and other ATGMs to wreak havoc on unsuspecting tanks. The next crucial US weapon which has been utilized in Ukraine are several varieties of kamikaze drones. These have become a serious thorn in Putin's side, giving him a small taste of his own medicine. First is the Switchblade. The drone's name comes from the way the spring-loaded wings are folded up inside a tube and flipped out once released. Designed and manufactured by California defense company Avex Aerospace, Switchblade drones are light and small enough to fit in a backpack. Launched from a portable 2-foot tube, each drone flies to the target area and can loiter, waiting for its target for up to an hour. Once the target approaches, an operator instructs the drone to dive toward enemy personnel and detonate a small grenade-like charge, releasing a shotgun spray of shrapnel in a specific direction. Its loitering nature means that unlike most other weapons, the Switchblade can wave off or abort a mission if the situation changes after launch, allowing it to engage a secondary target or destroy itself without inflicting casualties or damage to property. Its small size and extended operation time also make it great for destroying entrenched infantry, or even lightly armored vehicles like trucks. Videos like this one, shared on Twitter by open-source analyst Abraxas Spar, show Ukrainian operators launching Switchblades from city streets, before retreating to hidden positions to help guide them. While there are no definitive numbers on targets eliminated with Switchblade drones, it seems likely that they have accounted for hundreds of Russian casualties and equipment losses. There are also 2 varieties of the drone, the 300 and 600 models. The Switchblade 300 was widely used by US troops in Afghanistan against the Taliban, but considered less than ideal for the higher intensity warfare in Ukraine. Most of those given to Ukraine appear to be the 600 model, which is much larger and heavier, but has a longer flight time and larger payload, making it ideal for taking out heavy armor or fortified positions. But US military aid extended beyond the Switchblade as well. The Pentagon has also given Ukrainian forces a number of Phoenix Ghost drones. These were also developed by Avex under the US military's Big Safari weapons program, meant to rapidly acquire and deploy weapons to meet unexpected threats without relying on new research and development. The US has supplied over 1,000 of these killer drones so far, which have proven to be similarly lethal in the hands of Ukrainian operators. While even the larger Switchblades are limited to an hour of loitering, the Phoenix Ghost can hover over an area for up to 6 hours at a time, making it a much deadlier surprise weapon. It can also conduct both day and nighttime surveillance thanks to its advanced infrared sensors, but like the Switchblade, once a target has been detected and identified, the drone dives downwards and explodes on impact. The primary downside of the Phoenix Ghost drone appears to be its reduced speed, which appears in videos to be roughly half that of the Switchblade 600. Even so, Alexei Arestovich, advisor to the Ukrainian president's office, told reporters last year that 580 of such units equals about 350 destroyed targets in the close rear, indicating a roughly 60% success rate. It's unclear how much this has changed, but it seems likely that US-supplied loitering munitions continue to play a big role in Ukraine's ability to strike behind Russian lines. The latest US aid package to Ukraine from July 2023, containing over $1.3 billion of equipment, also reportedly contains hundreds of new Switchblades and Phoenix Ghosts. This is especially important since Kyiv acknowledged in May that its forces are losing about 10,000 drones per month during both intelligence gathering and strike activities. Similarly, military experts have said the relatively large losses of troops and slow advance of Ukrainians' recently launched counteroffensive are due primarily to the dense landmines Russian troops have laid in anticipation. That potentially deadly terrain separating defenders from invading forces will therefore make additional drones capable of inflicting precise attacks on distant targets especially useful. But just why is Russia having so much trouble dealing with these US-made drones? The simple answer is that the country hasn't effectively prepared for modern warfare. Despite its pre-invasion claims that its military could take on even the USA, the fact of the matter is that Russian commanders have proven they have no idea how to wage modern, combined arms warfare. By keeping different elements of their forces isolated and working individually, rather than in coordination, everything from Russian armor to supply lines to infantry troops are far more vulnerable than they should be. There's also the small problem that intelligence gathering among different elements of the Russian military is essentially non-existent. Because different Russian officials are constantly out to get each other and competing for power and influence, they have a strong incentive to let each other's forces take most of the losses, to try and preserve their own power. Obviously, this doesn't work very well when you're facing a determined and increasingly well-armed enemy like Ukraine. The astronomical Russian casualties after a year and a half of fighting are proof enough that Western smart munitions like the Switchblade and Phoenix Ghost are more than Putin's commanders can handle. The less obvious answer is that while Russia is especially unprepared, very few militaries today are prepared to effectively counter the threat of loitering aerial munitions. Just about any force on the planet, including the US itself, would be hard-pressed to defend against repeated strikes by kamikaze drones. There's simply no way to provide infantry troops with effective protection from them, especially as anti-aircraft guns can almost never hit every drone launched. The best way to defend against something like the Switchblade or Phoenix Ghost are electronic countermeasures, such as EMP pulses, which can knock out the signal of overhead drones. Even so, Russia simply does not have the capabilities to stop their strikes, making these some of the most effective weapons supplied to Ukraine so far. Another critical piece of military hardware that Russia has struggled against is the Stinger missile system. At the start of the war, large numbers of Russian aircraft were operating over Ukraine's airspace, leading to predictions that they would soon establish air superiority. But this wasn't on the cards either. And one main reason is the FIM-92 Stinger missile and its counterparts from around the world given to Ukraine. First entering service in 1981, the Stinger is a man-portable air defense system, or MANPADS, developed by defense giant Raytheon. Russia first encountered these deadly platforms all the way back in 1985, during its invasion of Afghanistan. Back then, the US supplied the Afghan Mujahideen fighters with Stingers, which they put to remarkable use for the next few years. The Stinger hasn't changed much since then. It can engage a target from nearly 2.5 miles away, making it perfect for taking out low-flying aircraft and helicopters. The Stinger's missile is 5 feet long and 2.8 inches in diameter. The missile itself weighs 22 pounds, while the missile with its launch tube and integral sight fitted with a gripstock and identification friend or foe (IFF) antenna weighs approximately 34 pounds. The Stinger uses a smart seeker head able to differentiate between an enemy's exhaust plume and engines, helping it home in on even rapidly moving targets. The warhead itself is roughly 2.3 pounds of HTA-3 explosive, a deadly mix of HMX, TNT, and aluminium powder. This does not make the Stinger any less effective, however, since its targeting system allows it to strike the vulnerable engines of enemy aircraft. To fire the missile, a BCU, battery coolant unit, is inserted into the gripstock. This device consists of a supply of high-pressure argon gas, which is injected into the seeker to cryogenically cool it to operating temperature, and a thermal battery which provides power for target acquisition. A single BCU provides power and coolant for roughly 45 seconds, after which another must be inserted if the missile has not been fired. Guidance to the target is initially achieved through proportional navigation, but once in flight, switches to another mode, which is what allows the missile to avoid exhaust plumes. The answer to why the Stingers have been so effective against Russia this time around again has a lot to do with terrible military doctrine and planning. Russia has long struggled to integrate its use of air power with ground campaigns, something which Ukrainians have been exploiting for more than a year. Because Russia conducted its air sorties independently of ground advances, Ukraine was able to shoot down huge numbers of its low-flying vehicles with Stingers and other manpad systems. This was also not helped by Russia's basic lack of precision targeting. Most of its aircraft, especially older models, lack the modern targeting pods found on Western jets, meaning they have to dip low to have any hope of precise strikes on enemy positions. This leaves them extremely vulnerable to surface-to-air missiles like the Stinger, especially when they cannot detect where the missiles are coming from. Next, no video about US weapons would be complete without mention of the HIMARS system. This powerful rocket artillery system is one of the crown jewels of US aid to Ukraine, and in recent months, report suggests they have become increasingly decisive in determining the direction of the war. HIMARS stands for High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, a variety of the MLRS rockets, which have been in use since the 1990s. The HIMARS are considered most effective for attacking stationary targets, such as infrastructure and troops in a concentrated area, but their extremely long range means that they can be used from far behind the front lines. As Ian Williams, Deputy Director of the Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, has noted, HIMARS is one of the world's most advanced rocket artillery systems. Its range is farther than anything the Ukrainians had, so when that was transferred, they got the ability to strike targets deeper behind the front lines and much more accurately. Other experts largely concur, and many have pointed out that without the use of HIMARS, Ukraine would not have been able to liberate nearly as much territory as it has. HIMARS rockets have been particularly effective in fighting Russia's offensive in Donbass by allowing Ukraine to attack Russian supply and ammunition depots. They were also crucial in forcing Russia to withdraw from Kherson. George Barros, an analyst on the Russia and Ukraine portfolio at the Institute for the Study of War, concluded that was only possible because the Ukrainians had this extended strike capability to degrade those bridges. Without the HIMARS, I don't think the Ukrainians would have liberated Kherson. And while it's certainly powerful, the HIMARS does not have either the range or payload of its cousin, the M270 MLRS. But what it lacks in range and firepower, the HIMARS more than makes up for in maneuverability. Its concept came about at the end of the Cold War, when it became apparent that the US military would be fighting more low-intensity conflicts in multiple environments. This led the Pentagon to move away from clunky, traditional rocket artillery and towards systems with a lighter footprint. It's this speed and maneuverability which has made the HIMARS so important for Ukraine's war effort. Faced with Russia's overwhelming numbers, Ukraine needed a platform able to rapidly deliver a payload and depart before it could be targeted with enemy counter-battery fire or airstrikes. Traditional artillery would most likely have been blown to bits before it could be moved, have let them launch numerous strikes without substantial retaliation, and once a HIMARS is fired, it usually finds its target. Each of its 6 GLMRS rockets has a range of 57 miles and is armed with a high-precision warhead. This means it can fire from well outside the range of traditional artillery and still hit its targets within several meters of accuracy. This has enabled Ukraine to strike at highly entrenched Russian positions, targeting their weakest points. HIMARS rockets can also each be set to independent targets, or used for repeated strikes on the same area of a fortification. Since Ukraine received its HIMARS, it has used them to take out everything from ammunition depots to command and control centers, managing to slow Russian advances to a crawl. Yet despite devoting large amounts of air power to taking out the missiles, Russia has apparently failed to touch 90% of them, instead losing more and more aircraft to Stingers every time it's tried. Part of the reason for this is that in addition to utilizing the HIMARS mobility, Ukraine also created multiple dummies, consisting of a generic heavy-duty truck frame, painted green and made to look as though it's carrying missiles. Ukraine has also apparently gotten so good at using HIMARS that it has actually been able to take out stalled tank columns, despite the system's intended use against stationary targets. As of last month, the US has supplied 38 HIMARS to Ukraine, but soon it may need more. Former Ukrainian Marine and captured British fighter Aidan Aslin recently told Newsweek that Russia appears to be hoarding its battlefield resources further away, out of HIMARS range. This suggests that the country will soon need more weapons with even greater reach, such as ATACMS or British Storm Shadow missiles. But experts also say the real advantage of sending different long-range missiles lies not in their individual capabilities, but in the numbers. The more missiles Kyiv can get its hands on, the more chances they have to strike Russian targets and the more damage they can do. All of this suggests that while the war shows no signs of stopping soon, Russia remains unable to deal with the superior firepower the US has provided Ukraine. It's not likely to get any better anytime soon either, as Russia continues to run out of resources and trained personnel. But what do you think? Will more US weapons ultimately be what ends the war? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. After defeating Russia's attempt to take its capital, Ukraine stunned the world again in the summer and fall of 2022, when its armed forces rapidly liberated thousands of square kilometers of territory from the Russian invaders. The twin offensives in the north and south essentially lifted the threat to Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, and freed Kherson from Russian occupation that November. The rapid progress of Ukraine's offensives left the world eagerly anticipating when and where it would strike in 2023, as Russia ground itself to a halt in the struggle for the city of Bakhmut in the Donetsk Oblast. The city eventually fell, but Ukraine launched its highly anticipated offensive soon thereafter. The offensive attacked along toward Bakhmut, but the operation in Zaporizhzhia Oblast was much more important. This offensive aimed to reach the Sea of Azov and cut the Russian land bridge to Crimea. Unfortunately, the 2023 offensive did not prove as effective as 2022's campaign. Ukrainian forces ground forward, but only slowly, as Russian minefields and fortifications proved large obstacles. The much-hoped-for breakthrough from Ukraine and its allies seemed like it would not materialize, and with the muddy season rapidly approaching, the campaign could only be called a modest success. Russia seemed to adapt to Ukraine's successes from 2022. For example, the Russian army put its supply hubs and command and control centers further back from the front line to protect them from HIMARS attacks. This and other adaptations turned the 2023 campaign into one of attrition, which the Russian army was much better suited to. Despite the arrival of Western main battle tanks like the German Leopard and American Abrams, and the use of cluster bombs by the Ukrainians starting in July, no major change to the war's status seemed to occur. Do the Ukrainians have a chance to achieve a breakthrough before the end of the campaigning season? They might, but why, up until recently, has the 2023 campaign been less than stellar so far, and how might Ukraine be able to turn the situation around? Let's take a look at where the Ukrainians were at the start of the offensive, where they are now, and the dangers that still await them. After the Ukrainian successes of 2022, which ended with the recapture of Kherson, winter settled in. The offensive ground to a halt, and Russia used the opportunity to lick its wounds. At the time, most of the world's attention was riveted on Soledar and Bakhmut, which Russia sought to capture at the cost of tens of thousands of casualties. Meanwhile, Russia was also building the most extensive and elaborate network of fortifications seen in Europe since World War I, and arguably the most formidable in the world outside the demilitarized zone across the Korean peninsula. This was especially the case in the Zaporizhzhia Oblast. This was a vital area to protect, as Ukrainian successes there would cut the Russian army's land bridge to Crimea. That would be a strategic disaster for Russia, as the peninsula is one of its army's most important supply hubs. It would also endanger Vladimir Putin's hold on power, as he promoted the annexation of Crimea in 2014 as one of his greatest achievements. It's hard to see how he would survive losing the war in Ukraine and losing control over Crimea. As early as December 2022, it became apparent that Russia was fortifying the area to protect the access to Crimea. Late that month, Russian forces began to turn the city of Melitopol in Zaporizhzhia Oblast into a heavily armed fortress. The Russian army concentrated troops in the vicinity and built a network of Dragon's Teeth covering the entire city, according to Ivan Fedorov, the mayor of the occupied city. Melitopol sits on a major road network in the area and is only about 100 kilometers northeast of Crimea. It was also clear at the end of 2022 that the Russian forces were digging in around the city of Tokmak, another key transit hub in the Zaporizhzhia Oblast, further north of Melitopol. The Russian army was surrounding the city with a network of trenches and fortifications. As winter settled in over the front and the bulk of the fighting took place around Bakhmut, Russia continued to improve on this network of fortifications. Ukraine's Western allies did not help matters, as they dithered over the delivery of weapons the Ukrainian military had been asking for, such as tanks and longer-range missiles like the American ATACMS. Satellite images taken of the fortifications in Zaporizhzhia Oblast early in 2023 showed deep lines of trenches, personnel positions, rows of dragon's teeth barriers to impede the movement of tanks, and well-sited artillery placements. By the middle of April 2023, the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense reported that the Russians had completed a defense in depth of 3 layers, covering approximately 120 kilometers in length. The first layer was a front line of forward combat positions to weaken an initial Ukrainian attack. The second and third lines of defense were more elaborate and came about 10 to 20 kilometers behind the preceding lines. The fortifications were likely the responsibility of the Russian Southern Grouping of Forces, SGF. As Russia became convinced that an offensive toward Melitopol was coming, it fortified the entire axis of attack to that city. The UK MOD said on April 12th that these fortifications could prove a significant obstacle, but their utility depended on whether the SGF could support them with sufficient manpower and artillery, and it was not sure if it had the capacity to muster such resources. In total, war watchers had described a vast defensive network stretching from Melitopol, with defensive lines encircling Tokmak and the city of Vasilivka, and eastward onward to Poloy by the middle of April 2023. The Zaporizhzhia defenses also include minefields in front of and between the main lines, and anti-tank ditches that require engineering equipment to plug. The fortifications in Zaporizhzhia came a few kilometers behind the front lines and were interlinked with a network stretching through the entire Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine. The Russian forces were also heavily fortifying northern Crimea. This would seem odd because Crimea is well behind the front lines, but for the Russians, there can be no risk of losing the peninsula, and they will protect it in almost any way they can. Western observers hoped the Ukrainians would be able to succeed in the coming offensive by using the tanks they were now receiving to exploit breakthroughs and open gaps for further attacks. However, the delay in the arrival of these tanks would not help this plan. Ukraine needed to wait for a sufficient number of its new assets to arrive, as crews trained on several different tank models. This delay gave the Russians time to dig in even deeper. The first line of defense eventually became the strongest of the 3. Ukraine's offensive in Zaporizhzhia Oblast finally began in early June, later than many analysts had expected. As the world's attention was fixed on the destruction of the Novokakhovka Dam on the Dnipro River days earlier, Ukrainian forces attacked south of the town of Orikhiv, toward occupied Tokmak in the western part of the oblast. However, it became clear early on that the offensive was going slower than expected. President Zelensky acknowledged this at the time, but insisted that he would not cut corners and play with the lives of his country's troops. By the end of August, Ukraine had liberated the village of Robotyne, which is approximately 15 kilometers south of Orikhiv and 23 kilometers north of Tokmak. This was a sign of the attritional nature of the campaign. Ukrainian forces were making stunning advances a year earlier, but now they were grinding south very slowly over months, and Russian minefields, artillery, anti-tank obstacles, and even tunnels were making the Ukrainian troops pay dearly for the land that they took. Russian helicopters had also been active, providing the ground forces with the close air support they had often lacked before that point. The Russians counterattacked at Robotyne on September 6th, but were beaten back. As of late October, Tokmak has still not been taken, much less Melitopol. While the Zaporizhzhia offensive got the most attention because it was the most important, Ukraine was active in other sectors as well. It conducted counterattacks around the captured city of Bakhmut, staged some operations around the Kherson front where it even managed to establish a beachhead on the opposite side of the Dnipro, and applied pressure throughout the entire front line, using infantry companies to attack in constant low-level sorties. Ukraine's Western allies were not entirely pleased with this strategy and pressured the Ukrainians to concentrate their forces on 1 or 2 centers of advance. However, for the Ukrainians, this play has had a few advantages. First, it pins down other Russian forces and prevents them from reinforcing the sectors that Ukraine is most interested in. Russia has been mostly on the defensive since the capture of Bakhmut in May, and has only recently begun offensive operations in Avdiivka in Donetsk Oblast. But Russian military bloggers are divided on the success of this attack, and they have complained that the Ukrainian drones have made armored assaults costly. Meanwhile, Ukrainian minefields are obstructing further advances in the area, a reality that has shades of the difficulties Ukraine has faced in the Zaporizhzhia offensive. Ukrainian sources have stated that Russia continues to transfer forces to the Avdiivka sector, indicating that its attacks may not yet be over. Overall, Ukraine's strategy to pin the Russian forces down all across the front while it continues its assault into Zaporizhzhia might be finally paying off. Despite the overall disappointment in the offensive, Ukraine achieved something important at the end of September. It had broken through the Surovikin Line, named after the general who was its architect. The Surovikin Line is the first and strongest of the Russian defensive lines in the Zaporizhzhia Oblast. But how did Ukraine manage this breakthrough after many months of seemingly grinding forward with no result? It learned from its bitter experience in the early days of the counteroffensive. For example, Ukraine stopped using artillery to directly support its infantry assaults. That wasn't exactly good news for those units, since the lack of fire support to pin enemy defenders down would have made them much more vulnerable. There was a catch though. Ukraine waited for Russian artillery to shoot first. Then it used its Western-supplied counter-battery radars to fire back, enacting precision strikes on the Russian artillery positions and destroying their guns. The Ukrainians proved so effective at this that related complaints quickly spread around Russian social media sites. The loss of fire support made the Russian units, even those well dug in, vulnerable. After breaching the Surovikin Line, Ukraine did not continue to advance to the south directly and ran straight into the teeth of the second line of defense. Instead, Ukrainian units turned to the east and struck around the village of Verbove. The presence of Ukrainian troops in the area confirmed that they had indeed achieved the breakthrough of the first line. From there, Ukrainian troops attacked the second defensive line in a place the Russians did not expect. On September 22nd, the Ukrainians broke into the city. Later, geolocated footage confirmed that Ukrainian troops were operating behind Russia's second defensive line in the Zaporizhzhia Oblast. However, about a month later, there is no news that the village has been recaptured from the Russians. Still, it is the most rapid progress made since the start of the Zaporizhzhia campaign. As of October 24th, Ukraine was also making advances toward the villages of Kopani and Novoprokopivka. Russian military bloggers claim that counterattacks are taking place near Verbove and Robotyne, but the situation is muggy, which is actually good news for Ukraine. That information is rapidly changing amid a confused picture indicates that the action in Zaporizhzhia is fluid and that operations are no longer static assaults against heavily fortified Russian positions. One has been confirmed. Ukrainian forces have gotten behind a regiment's worth of some of Russia's most elite paratroopers, the VDV Airborne Forces. These troops were called in from the north of Ukraine to reinforce the fortifications in Zaporizhzhia. Again, this is good news for Ukraine because it indicates that Russia is worried that its defenses will crack. There are fears among Russian military bloggers that this elite unit will be encircled and destroyed by Ukrainian forces in the area. Are these units being sacrificed to slow the Ukrainian advance as winter rapidly approaches? That would not be out of the question. The VDV units have suffered heavy casualties since the start of the invasion, as the Russian military has often used these units improperly. According to the commander of this force, Colonel General Mikhail Teplinsky, at least 8,500 of these paratroopers have been wounded in action since the war began, and a few days later, the UK Ministry of Defence assessed that at least half of the 30,000 paratroopers dispatched to Ukraine had become casualties. These casualties have since been replaced by troops that are far from elite in character. Now these paratroopers are airborne in name only, as they have been intermingled with regular motorized rifle brigades to defend the line in Zaporizhzhia. Meanwhile, Ukraine has several armored brigades equipped with the Western main battle tanks it received early in the year, waiting in reserve in the area, poised to exploit a breakthrough. If these tanks can widen the gaps the infantry opens for them, the Russian forces manning the defenses in Zaporizhzhia may find themselves encircled. If such a thing were to occur, the road to Tokmak would be open. If Tokmak falls, the Russian land bridge to Crimea would be in serious danger, as it is an important logistics hub in the area. It would be an excellent staging point for a Ukrainian advance to the Sea of Azov, which, if completed, would split the Russian forces occupying Ukraine in two and trap a sizable amount of Russia's total military power in a giant pocket between Crimea, the eastern part of Kherson Oblast, and the Ukrainian front lines in Zaporizhzhia. The success of such an operation would open Crimea itself to a siege in the coming campaign. Ukraine has anticipated a Russian retreat to Crimea. That is why it's launched precision strikes against key targets there, like military bases, landing ships, and even submarines. One of the targets was the headquarters of Russia's Black Sea Fleet at Sevastopol, which was once thought to have killed the fleet's commander, although that particular claim was subsequently debunked. Ukraine has also carried out special operations against Russia's S-400 air defense systems stationed in Crimea, which resulted in Russia losing 3 out of 5 batteries there. The attacks in Crimea have even further eroded the combat effectiveness of the Black Sea Fleet, which had launched frequent missile strikes into Ukraine despite being docked for most of the war. With that becoming less of an option, Russia may need to use its air force much more than it has to make up for the shortfall in firepower. With F-16s armed with long-range air-to-air missiles soon set to arrive in Ukraine, that is not an exciting prospect for Russia either. There's also grim news for Russia on the ground. After many months of wavering, the Biden administration finally approved Ukraine's request for ATACMS missiles as the summer ended. These ground-based ballistic missiles have a range of 300 kilometers, and their arrival has now put all of Russia's bases in Ukrainian territory within range of HIMARS. Ukraine demonstrated Russia's new danger when it fired its ATACMS missiles, which were armed with cluster munitions, for the first time on October 17th. The attacks, which came in the cities of Berdyansk and Luhansk, targeted Russian airfields. In addition to the heavy damage to the infrastructure, the ATACMS missiles and their set of 1,000 separate submunitions destroyed up to 21 enemy helicopters. It was the biggest blow to the Russian Air Force in the war. Meanwhile, dozens of Russian troops were killed or wounded in the operation. This was the result of using just 3 ATACMS missiles. The attack clearly struck a nerve with Putin. When speaking to reporters in Beijing amidst his attendance of China's Belt and Road Forum on October 18th, Putin singled out ATACMS in particular. If Russia has lost the war, why do they, the United States, supply ATACMS? Let's take them back and all the other weapons. Biden can take a seat and eat pancakes and visit us for some tea. If the war is lost, what are we talking about? Why ATACMS? Ask him that. It's funny. Firstly, this of course causes harm and creates an additional threat. Secondly, we will of course be able to repel these attacks. War is war, and of course they pose a threat, that goes without saying. But most importantly, this will not change the situation of the line of contact dramatically at all. It just prolongs the agony. Some commentators found this quotation interesting, as they believe it was the first time Putin referred to his so-called special military operation in Ukraine as a war. But the Russian dictator was quoting Biden for that part of the message. What is more important was Putin's defensiveness about the ATACMS missiles. He knows the threat that they pose to his army in Ukraine, and their arrival means the options are narrowing. With the arrival of ATACMS and F-16s, Ukraine now has almost all of the weapons it requested since the start of the war. The traditional campaigning season may be drawing to a close, but Ukraine is also making plans to continue its offensive into the winter months, learning the lessons from last year. So although the attack through Zaporizhzhia in the summer and into the fall was far slower than many hoped for, Ukraine now has the momentum and the tools to effect the much-desired breakthrough if it handles its operations properly. For Ukraine, the biggest danger is now not military in nature, but political. The slow pace of the Zaporizhzhia offensive has emboldened the critics of aid to Ukraine, especially in the United States, which has just been through a period of congressional chaos where rogue members of the narrow Republican majority voted to oust their own speaker. As a result, the US House of Representatives could not do its business for 3 weeks. Aid to Ukraine has been a topic of heated division within the Republican Party's ranks, and the United States is about to enter a presidential election, where assistance to Kyiv will be a notable issue. Joe Biden is unpopular at home, and it's unknown what the Republican nominee's position on the issue will be. If Ukraine seeks to avoid the loss of the American support it needs to win the war, it must continue to demonstrate the capability of making serious gains on the battlefield. Its performance on the battlefield in the coming months could prove decisive to its viability. Its military capability is there, but will the United States commit to it for the long term? All eyes will be watching how the results on the battlefields of Ukraine interact with America's chaotic partisan politics of 2024. But what do you think? Is Ukraine close to a breakthrough in the Zaporizhzhia Oblast? Will it soon cut the Russian land bridge to Crimea? How will domestic American politics affect the coming year in the war? Be sure to let us know what you think in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. While we've said it before, we'll say it again. Vladimir Putin is in trouble, and it's worse than you think. The man who has ruled Russia with an iron fist for more than 20 years finally jeopardized his own future when he invaded Ukraine last spring. That decision has led to a string of remarkable defeats and failures, which has exposed cracks in Putin's rule for the first time in decades. Now, a year and a half later, they are presenting enormous challenges that he might not be able to crush with force. From the outside, Putin's continued belligerence towards Ukraine and the West is puzzling. since it has left him in a far worse spot geopolitically than he was at the start of 2022. But as William Shakespeare once wrote, "Uneasy wears the head that lies the crown." Putin has been uneasy in his seat of power for many, many years. This insecurity has driven him to obsession and helped him turn into the ruthless, corrupt, and jingoistic dictator we see today, one who silences any dissent inside his country, has journalists and defectors abroad murdered in broad daylight, and even faced a brief rebellion from his own confidants earlier this year. He can't even admit that this is a war, violently suppressing anyone who doesn't refer to it as a special military operation. But all these mistakes and tactics have also exposed the cracks in Putin's rule. His miscalculations about Ukraine and his ability to succeed there have left him weak, isolated, and flailing. He faces simmering tensions at home, an exodus of young and talented individuals from Russia, and a conscript army seemingly incapable of attacking or defending well enough to win any real victories. And despite its slow pace, Putin now also faces a Ukrainian counteroffensive which may retake even the small parts of the country which Putin has been able to hold on to. While it's unclear how successful the effort will prove to be, the counteroffensive seems to be developing along three axes which could seriously challenge Putin's capabilities. One is the southern Zaporizhzhia Oblast, one to the east in the Donetsk Oblast, and the other around the destroyed northern city of Bakhmut. Ukraine also continues to launch cross-border raids into Russia's territory near the city of Belgorod, where Russian military bloggers have claimed that entire regiments have been wiped out. From all these sources and more, it's clear that Putin faces numerous challenges to his future and possibly his life. It's also clear that he cannot afford to admit that he's screwed up, as his efforts to crush dissent and keep the Russian people on his side have been intense. And yet even Putin has had to admit in recent weeks that the war he and his yes-men launched is going poorly. Ukraine's counteroffensive, which some have claimed is going poorly, has still been effective enough that Putin admitted on June 9, 2023 that, "In recent days we have seen significant losses in Ukraine." While this is clearly understating things quite a bit, it's also among the very first times Putin has been forced to acknowledge his problems at all. From a brutal dictator, this is about as close as it gets to a mea culpa. And things don't look to be getting much better. Despite taking heavy losses in their initial assaults of Russian positions, Ukraine's armed forces have made significant progress in breaking through fortified defensive lines in the country's southeast. Specifically, the most notable gains have been south of the Dnipro River, which divides the half-liberated city of Kherson. Russian military bloggers reported that up to 7 boats, each carrying 6 to 7 people, had landed near the village of Kazachyi-Laheri, east of Kherson City, on Tuesday, and broke through Russian defensive lines. It was claimed that the Ukrainian soldiers had advanced up to 800 meters after getting to the riverbank, though it appeared Russian forces had some success in fighting them back. The Russian-imposed head of the occupied part of the Kherson Oblast, Vladimir Saldo, claimed the Ukrainian raid had been repelled. However, the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, a think tank in Washington which closely tracks the conflict, said that it appeared that the limited raid may have had more success than Saldo had acknowledged. ISW wrote in a recent update that the majority of prominent Russian military bloggers claimed that Ukrainian forces managed to utilize tactical surprise and land on the East Bank before engaging Russian forces in small arms exchanges, and Saldo was likely purposefully trying to refute claims of Ukrainian presence in this area to avoid creating panic in the already delicate Russian information space. The report added that satellite imagery suggested that a major battle had taken place, and that by the end of the day on 8th of August, many Russian sources had updated their claims to report that Russian forces retained control over Kazachyi-Laheri, having pushed Ukrainian forces back to the shoreline, and that small arms skirmishes are occurring in shoreline areas near Kazachyi-Laheri and other East Bank settlements. This development in the fighting also poses a major threat to Russian supply lines and the key transportation hub of Melitopol, which serves as a gateway to the still-occupied port cities of Berdyansk and Mariupol. If Ukraine is able to retake these cities, it could cut off Russian support to nearly a third of their soldiers, stationed in the southeast and on the Crimean Peninsula. There are already numerous reports of sabotage train lines between Crimea and Melitopol, which may be impacting Russia's ability to move troops and supplies from one city to the other. These attacks are also only a small part of the broader Ukrainian sabotage operations which continue across the battle space, as well as in Russia itself. There have been twice as many of this type of attack in the first 6 months of 2023 than in the entire previous year. Besides psychologically messing with Russian troops, operations like this also help to weaken key defensive positions. If Ukraine can use them to escalate into a full assault on Melitopol, Berdyansk and Mariupol, that will leave only a single reliable supply route from Russia into Crimea, via the already damaged Kerch Bridge. The previous attack on that bridge, which remains unconfirmed but has been attributed to Ukraine, prove that this is vulnerable to sabotage. From reports and footage, it appeared as though a truck bomb was responsible, one which originated from within Russia's own borders. If Ukraine can pull off another similar attack able to destroy the bridge, it will leave the tens of thousands of Russian troops in Crimea essentially stranded. Even more important, it will leave no way for Russia to move heavy equipment like tanks, artillery systems, and supply vehicles onto the peninsula. This could prove disastrous and severely limit Putin's ability to sustain the war effort. In addition to giving ground under Ukrainian assaults south of the Dnipro, Russian troops have also been forced to retreat on the northern and southern axis of the conflict, near the ruins of the city of Bakhmut. When the Russian PMC Wagner Group announced that they had finally retaken Bakhmut several months back, they also announced that their forces would be pulling away from the front line. This was likely due to the many months of heavy losses, which would also eventually lead Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin to stage his ill-fated mutiny against Putin back in July. Prigozhin announced that he was turning Bakhmut over to the regular Russian forces. Within days of this taking place, Ukraine began systematic attacks on both the northern and southern approaches to the city, working to encircle the Russian troops inside. Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar recently stated that, in the Bakhmut sector, 3 square kilometers (1.2 square miles) were liberated last week, and that in total, 40 square kilometers (15.5 square miles) have been liberated on the southern flank of the Bakhmut sector. But this may also continue to shift in Ukraine's favor, as the country receives more and more advanced military supplies from the US and NATO. Some of these have already arrived and been put to use, such as armored vehicles like the German-made Leopard tanks and US Bradley fighting vehicles. Most weapon systems manufactured in the West come with advanced targeting and night warfare capabilities, which Russia has either too few of or lacks entirely. These capabilities have allowed Ukrainian forces to undertake a large number of successful night operations, something experts have recently started pointing to as a major factor behind Ukrainian battlefield gains. Another source of Ukrainian dominance has been the influx of US-made precision artillery, such as the HIMARS rocket system and GPS-guided Excalibur shells. These have provided Ukraine with the ability to target Russian ammunition depots, fuel production facilities, and command and control centers. Combined with the power of long-range Western rockets such as the British-supplied Storm Shadow missile, this has led to several devastating strikes far behind Russian lines. Just weeks ago, Ukraine struck 2 of the bridges in the Crimean Peninsula, with at least 1 hit by Storm Shadow missiles, according to Ukrainian and Russian officials. And that same day, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense released images confirming the arrival of Scalp EG missiles, the French version of the Storm Shadow. The weapons being delivered may also be even more powerful than publicly disclosed. A colonel in Kyiv's Air Defense Command, who was not named, recently told the Times of London that the missiles in Ukraine's possession have twice their publicized range, about 310 miles rather than 155 miles advertised by its manufacturer. There are still options for more powerful systems to be delivered as well. Biden is said to be debating the delivery of the ultra-long-range ATACMS or Army Tactical Missile Systems. ATACMS has a routine range of around 200 miles, as well as highly accurate precision targeting capabilities. Meanwhile, Russia has run so low on ammunition that Putin has been forced to turn to countries like North Korea and Iran to supply artillery shells, some of which are likely more than 50 years old. Reportedly, during a recent test of similar ammunition by North Korea, over a quarter of the shells failed to detonate at all. Iran is also selling their least expensive drones to Russia, including the Shahed 129, Shahed 191, and Mahaja 6 models, which Russia has used to launch indiscriminate attacks on civilian targets and energy infrastructure. While these drones are deadly and terrifying, they are unlikely to be enough to turn the tide of the war. With new Russian weaknesses being exposed every week, Putin also increasingly runs the risk of his top generals turning on him, or ordinary Russians rising up over the staggering losses and failure to achieve any real gains. The frustration over the war is becoming more and more noticeable, even among the tightly censored and controlled Russian media. Igor Strelkov is a former Russian intelligence officer who has boasted that he pulled the war's trigger by leading Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea and of ordering the torture and execution of pro-Ukrainian officials, police officers, and war prisoners in Donetsk. Until recently, Strelkov was a rising star in the world of pro-war Russian Telegram bloggers, but after Prigozhin's mutiny, Strelkov posted, among other insults, that for 23 years at the helm of Russia was a nobody who could fool most Russians. 3 days later, he was arrested by Putin's security forces. The discontent has even spread to members of the Duma, Putin's hand-picked group of cronies who form the Russian legislature. One of its most influential members, Konstantin Zachulin, even recently dared to criticize the war in an international forum. Zachulin, who boasts close ties to top leaders of the FSB, said at a conference on the future of Ukraine that Russia had so far failed in all its war efforts, and that some of them had become senseless. Referencing the popular Russian rationale for the war, he stated that the original aims were denazification, demilitarization, neutrality for Ukraine, and the defense of the residents of Donetsk and Luhansk. On which of these points have we reached results today? Not one. Combined with Prigozhin's well-publicized mutiny and flight to Belarus, episodes like this show a Putin who is beginning to lose his grip on the levers of power. In a recent analysis, Tatiana Stanovaya, senior fellow at the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center, said Prigozhin had effectively chipped away at Putin's power vertical, or ability to rule effectively from the top down. Because of this, she argues, turmoil from the war is now producing dozens of mini Prigozhins, who are not as smart as the caterer-turned mercenary, but have become sure in recent months that post-Putin Russia is already here, even as Putin remains in charge. Putin also faces new international challenges to his authority and possibly freedom. Since even before February 2022, there have been numerous reports of the systematic abduction and relocation of children from the occupied areas of Ukraine. In March of 2023, this led to an arrest warrant for Putin being issued by the International Criminal Court on charges for war crimes. While not an immediate threat, these are further isolating him internationally, putting even his trips to non-aligned countries into jeopardy. For instance, in August, South Africa is hosting a summit for a meeting of the BRICS Group, a loose alliance of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But the month before, South Africa's government stated that Putin would not be attending the summit, and that Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov would attend instead. This was largely due to concerns over whether they would have to act on the international arrest warrant due to building public pressure. Developments like this isolate Putin even further, limiting the amount of places he can travel on state business and undermining his legitimacy as leader of Russia. And allegations of mass kidnapping are just the tip of the iceberg as far as war crimes are concerned. The Russian armed forces under direct control of Putin and his generals have been responsible for thousands of acts of torture and murder throughout the war and occupation of Ukraine. For instance, in the town of Bucha, on the outskirts of Kyiv, over 450 civilians were executed with hands tied behind their back and dumped in the streets. An inquiry by Radio Free Europe also discovered the use of a basement beneath a campground as a torture chamber. Many bodies were found mutilated and burnt, while girls as young as 14 reported being raped by Russian soldiers. This is just one massacre among hundreds, many of which are also being investigated by the International Criminal Court. Additionally, the US is currently hosting Ukrainian prosecutors to help them prepare to prosecute such acts. Ultimately, all of the horrifying violence can be laid at Putin's feet. This isn't just guesswork either. He's made it publicly clear, such as by giving medals to the unit responsible for carrying out the murders and other atrocities at Bucha. He has also received charges of ecocide for the destruction of the enormous Nova Kakhovka Dam, while Putin called the move barbaric and denied Russian involvement. But investigations have all concluded that Russia was responsible, as it controlled the dam before its destruction, while experts have concluded that the breach was caused by an internal explosion of hundreds of pounds of explosives. The dam was designed by the Soviets to withstand a nuclear attack, making it highly unlikely that any missile could have caused the damage it sustained. The dam's destruction is yet another terrible crime for which Putin is to blame. The event also suggests several more implications of his growing desperation. For example, more than 80% of the drinking and agricultural water in Crimea came straight from the lake that the dam controlled via canal. Putin's likely destruction of the dam may signal that he is aware he could lose control over Crimea at some point in the coming months, and is unwilling to let Ukraine have it either. By some estimates, it may take more than a decade for previous levels of drinking water to return to the peninsula. This is the move of a desperate tyrant, lashing out at enemies and lacking the long-term thinking necessary to hold on to power securely. Another factor, often discussed but still crucial, is the damage that Putin has done to Russia's economy and diplomatic presence around the world. Take oil. Russia has been one of the world's top 3 oil producers for decades, behind only the United States and Saudi Arabia. But the harsh sanctions, price caps, and export controls imposed by the US and Europe after the invasion have hit Russia's oil sector hard. This is despite Russia offering a massive $20 per barrel discount in the cost of its crude oil exports, in the hopes of using new buyers like India and China to replace EU members who have largely stopped buying. But that discount, combined with lower volume of sales, means a shortfall of over $65 billion per year. That's not to mention other price declines from the pre-invasion oil market. All things considered, Russia is likely to see a 2023 decline in oil and gas revenue of over $180 billion. A drop of this magnitude is likely to hit ordinary Russians, and possibly even the oligarchs, quite hard. The expenses of the invasion are also hitting the Russian economy more directly now. Putin recently imposed an extra 5% tax on extra profit made by Russian businesses, something which is basically determined by his cronies in the finance ministry. Another area Russia's economy has been hit hard is in its global military sales. Back in 2011, Russia nearly matched the US in volume of global arms sales. But as the country has become more isolated due to warmongering and its equipment has been shown ineffective, exports have plummeted more than 70%, with 2023 sales to only 12 countries. Western sanctions have also destroyed Russia's ability to obtain advanced computer chips for its modern military equipment, throwing doubt on whether it will be able to produce such systems for more than another year. That's not even getting into the enormous destruction of tanks, artillery, planes, and over 250,000 soldiers. All of this suggests one thing: Putin messed up badly. His war of imperialism has now turned into a series of self-inflicted wounds, which have brought Russia to its lowest point in decades, economically, militarily, and politically. With 2 new countries joining NATO and Ukraine's membership on the horizon, every aim of the war has become an abject failure. It seems likely that sooner, rather than later, these mistakes will eventually catch up to Putin and be his undoing. But what do you think? Will Putin's war end up pushing him from power? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis.